All right, looks like we are live, and I want to welcome everybody to Standing for Truth. My name is Donny, and I am your host and moderator for tonight's exciting debate on the Genesis flood. It is a privilege to have two heavyweights, two experienced debaters, Mark Reid and TRock, to debate this topic. Specifically, we are engaging the question, is there good scientific evidence for a worldwide flood? I have hosted Mark Reid many times. I have hosted TRock many times, and they are both fantastic debaters. They are always well prepped, well equipped for these discussions, and always very professional. So I'm excited to see what Mark and what TRock are going to bring to the table for tonight's epic exchange. And so before we get into the opening statements, as we usually do, let's get acquainted with our guests a bit. And so, Mark, why don't we start with you? Been a little bit since you've been here. I am keeping you busy this month, as you do have at least 3 debates, all debates that I'm really looking forward to. So, Mark, a little bit about yourself. How have you been? A little bit about your channel.
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. My channel's doing well, as much as I neglect it upon occasion. But yeah, that's just on your channel too, Donny. I've got a couple coming up on modern day debate, and I like to go over there. I might have another one coming up, depends how we go. But yeah, I'm doing fantastic, and I like debating. I like engaging with people on theology, philosophy, morality, anything really to do with the sort of debates going back and forth on YouTube. And I find it incredibly fun. So I'm going to be having fun this debate. And thanks for your time, and thanks for joining me. My background is distributed systems, so I'm sort of an IT person. But I do love getting into all of this, sort of back and forth on different subjects, and having great debates on them, and sort of interacting with people whose worldviews and mindsets are completely different than my own. Putting my ideas up against them and seeing how well they do is lots of fun. So thanks for having me, Donny. I really appreciate it. And thanks for being here, TRock, and being my opponent today.
My pleasure, Mark. Thank you for the great introduction. I appreciate your shared love and interest in debates. And so that is why we host so many debates here on so many different topics, is, as you put it, it gets us out of our theological and also our scientific echo chambers. It brings people into the debate octagon with differing views, and it gives us the opportunity to discuss and engage those views with different people. So that's awesome. If to the audience, if you like what you're hearing from Mark, please do check the description box. If you want to hear more from him, I've got his YouTube channel linked for people to check out. So again, Mark, appreciate the intro. TRock, good to have you back as well. I appreciate your time. And you were just here a couple of nights ago, as a matter of fact, for a debate on evolution. That was an excellent debate. And so, TRock, a little bit about yourself for anybody who might be unfamiliar with you.
Okay, thank you everybody for tuning in. It's always a pleasure to be here. I do like the debate arena, sort of. Not quite the same way Mark described, a little bit different. My passion is to present reasoned arguments to demonstrate that biblical creationists are not, radical fundamentalists with blind faith. We pursue solid science, solid history, solid philosophy, and my whole purpose here is to encourage, biblical creationists, i.e. Christians, to continue with what you've always known, and not to cave into what would otherwise be very bad philosophy, bad theology, and bad science. So busy time of year for me, so I apologize if I don't come across super prepared. It's just I run a side business and a day job, so anyway, I've got some interesting things I think we'll get to look at here in a little bit. And for those who really aren't familiar with me, my background is mechanical engineering and manufacturing. So I rather do enjoy putting physics to the origins discussions. So we'll get to do some of that in a little while.
Awesome. TRock, thanks for the introduction. Again, I appreciate your time that you've given to us for this debate and the other debates. And I've got at least a couple of your past debates linked, as well as you don't necessarily have a channel. But if you want to see more, to the audience, if you want to see more from TRock, check the description box. I've also got Mark Reid and TRock's previous debates linked for people to check out. If I remember correctly, a debate on the age of the earth. That was awesome. That was comprehensive, went over 4 hours. And then also a debate on the existence of God. And so with that, thanks again to our guests for the introductions. Let me go over the format for tonight's Genesis flood debate. Again, to anybody who's just joining us, we are debating the question, is there scientific evidence for a worldwide flood? So a fun topic, an interesting question. And the format is going to be 12-minute opening statements. Since TRock is in the affirmative, he will be kicking us off in the opening statements. Then we're going to have an 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttal, followed by a discussion. The discussion is going to be about 50 minutes. And rather than a real strict cross exam, we'll keep it more free flowing and organic. Then we'll have a 5-minute closing statement where the guests tonight can wrap up their thoughts and points. And then this is where we get you guys in the audience involved. We will have a roughly 25-minute audience Q&A period. And so if you have a question on the flood, please do tag me either at Donny or at Standing for Truth. Let me know who the question is for, either TRock or Mark Reid, and we'll have, as usual, a solid audience Q&A. Okay, let's get, with the formalities out of the way, let's get into the first opening statement. And TRock, whenever you're ready, you've got 12 minutes. If you need to screen share, feel free to do so, and I'll get your slides up there.
Okay, Donny, I am sharing my screen.
Perfect. Looks good, TRock. Whenever you're ready.
You see it? Okay, good deal.
Yeah.
Okay, let me get back on the first slide here, and let's get in presentation mode for a second. Okay, so flood dynamics. I want to talk about impact theory for just a moment. Not really the topic of the debate, but it's worth kind of going over a little bit of this, because ultimately, if you're going to say there was no global flood, you have to have some other history to compare it to see which one makes the most sense. So I'm going to just briefly go over impact theory. Now, I recognize that there may be multiple versions of this. So if Mark, for whatever reason, takes issue with the particular version I'm going to present, that's fine. But this is the way I understand the most popular version to look like. So I apologize again. Very crude drawing. I'm not an artist and I don't have good software, but essentially impact theory for the existence of the moon is kind of the reference frame here. So right here to the left of the screen, this is basically what I'm describing as a what's the word? The coalescence of meteor debris from space that accumulates in the solar system some 4.5, 4.6 billion years ago, until planet Earth is roughly formed. And then not too long in deep time history, there was supposedly what they would call a planetesimal that struck the Earth, and that is what was responsible for forming the moon. So with that, what you get out of that is a huge amount of heat. And so progressing from left to right, what I'm trying to describe here is that there's this ball of rocks that's sitting out here in space. Once it gets struck by the moon, it gets really shaken up, and that impact alone should add a tremendous amount of heat that wasn't already there. And so over what I am going to say must be a very short period of time relative to a 4.5 billion year timeline, this thing should actually, it can have all kinds of weird shapes and whatever it's doing, but once the heat is applied, it's going to kind of round out very quickly in regards to deep time. And so this on the right is basically representing the solid interior core and a very hot mantle with very little crust. But there's also water involved. So I want to talk for a minute about the heat portion and what its effect has to be on any body with mass. It doesn't matter what it is, but essentially all I'm describing here is a container like a pot. And let's say you have a chunk of gold. and it could be anything. It could be gold. It could be, wax, ice. It doesn't matter. Something solid. Once you start applying heat, you've got, some inclusions, some foreign debris kind of mixed in there in solid form that can't go anywhere while it's cold. But as you add heat, the thing starts to melt, starts to kind of flow a little bit, and starts to kind of level out. And you can see that the lighter or less dense debris will start coming to the top until you finally have a full thermal, what's the word I'm looking for? The thermal properties are more or less even throughout the body. And then all of your less dense stuff is at the top at that point. This can be a little bit of a process, but over time, the more segregated by density this should become, especially if heat is continually applied for a long duration of time. So, and this is basically the same thing, but now we've got to introduce the idea of water being present. So, after the moon strikes the Earth, there is water. There's an abundance of water, but where is it and what's it doing? Well, because the Earth is so hot, the water is pretty much the lightest substance on the Earth, besides the obvious gases. And there's some things out there that may be a little bit lighter. You can get more dense stuff to float on water via surface tension, but not much. So by and large, 100% water has to go to the top. All the minerals and all of the other material that whether it's mantle material or otherwise anything that would be in solid form once it gets down to room temperature, that sort of thing should be at the bottom. What does that imply? That implies this. Something that's almost never mentioned amongst evolutionists or deep time advocates is that with that problem, they actually have a very, very serious heat problem, in that in and of itself will basically create a global flood. All of the water would be at the top. The heat should be normalized or distributed evenly throughout the entire sphere of the globe. At least within probably a few million years, but probably much less than that. And it's very round at that point largely because of the heat, but gravity alone can assist with that. But gravity, objects under extreme pressure from gravity are going to heat up anyway. So I believe they also have in their paradigm that part of the heat here comes from radioactive decay, which we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the impact and the pressure from gravity alone adds significant amount of heat. And of course, you got the moon at this point, fully formed at some distance. They would like to argue that point, but it's not a favorable distance at all for their story, no matter where you put it. It literally doesn't matter. You can't put it in a correct place at this point. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about fluid flow now. This has been something that's come up multiple times in some of my recent debates, where the evolutionists or the deep time advocates do not seem to understand fluid dynamics very well at all. The general contention is that we have seen local floods and we know what floods look like, and they don't look like what we see in the geologic column. That's the general argument they make. But tonight I'm going to kind of clarify why it is that I'm confidently sure that is absolutely not the case. So what you're seeing here is basically representative of an open body of water with no obstruction. Water is incompressible, so when it flows, as long as there's nothing interrupting its path, it tends to normalize the flow in somewhat of a linear or parallel fashion like this. And this is what we would call in engineering laminar flow. In geology, they might call it sheet flow, but it's essentially the same thing. It's where the currents, even if they're not perfectly straight, they're more or less parallel, through a significant distance, so that you can easily identify them as being laminar, as opposed to what's called turbulent flow. Turbulent flow is where the direction and the velocity vectors of the water movement are much more chaotic and not parallel or remotely linear like this. So in this example, this is what is going to kind of be representative of a local flood. Notice the depth of the water here and the height of the objects that are interfering with the flow. As long as those objects are solid bodies of some sort, i.e. different density, different consistency than the water that they're in, the water is forced to go around them, right? And so that's where you get all of this turbulence, i.e. mixing. So you can kind of, they're not exactly the same, but you can kind of equate turbulence and mixing as roughly the same thing for the sake of this conversation. So you get a lot of erratic flow at this point. But it's specifically because the difference between the depth of the water and the size of the objects in it are too similar. So turbulence goes way up, laminar flow goes way down. Now, I didn't try to be uber accurate with this, but you can walk up to the bank of a river, for example, and kind of see this at different depths in the river. The closer, we'll call these rocks, since that's kind of what they look like, but the closer these rocks are to the surface, the more turbulence you get up at the surface of the water as well. But those same rocks could be in, water that's 20, 30 feet deep, way deeper than the size of the rock. And the turbulence at the surface is significantly decreased, right? So this is more indicative of what a global flood would look like, not to scale, of course, but in this case, we'll assume that the rocks I'm representing at the bottom are the same size as the ones on this page, but the depth of the water is much, much greater. So there is turbulent flow around these objects, but it's not enough to affect what's happening up high. Okay. And so that is a key component of understanding why what we see in the geologic column is absolutely the result of a global flood, not a shallow marine environment over millions of years. And we can talk about that. So that's going to become very relevant here in a little bit. Okay, now what this is a rough representation of a global flood transport of sediment. Sediment generally, now there's a lot of factors involved here. It's not as straightforward as just you have water and you have sediment in transport with the water. The size of the particles is going to be important. The amount, the total volume of particles in the water is going to be important. The water depth in relation to the amount of particles is important. So in laminar flow, we also talk quite a bit about this hydrological sorting thing, and we'll have to get into that more later probably, because I'm not going to have a whole lot of time to go real deep into here. But the amount of sorting you should get is going to be highly dependent on the velocity and the distance that the water transports the sediment and debris that's in it. So keep that in mind. We'll talk about that more later probably. Okay. I don't have a whole lot of time here, but one of the areas that I wanted to investigate here, this is called Deep Springs Valley in California. And so what you're seeing here is an area that rises up several thousand feet above sea level, but has a sunken in valley below it. But that valley is almost exclusively Precambrian and Cambrian. And it's at a very high elevation, as a matter of fact. So the other thing, I'm going to try and buzz through this because I see that I don't have a ton of time here, but also we need to talk about plate tectonics and continental movement. It is my contention, and I will go into this a little bit more in detail later, hopefully, but when it comes to plate tectonics, the general theory, as I understand it, and I've done some research on this to make sure I'm accurately representing what they believe, but it's basically boils down to convection currents up and down, forcing movement of the Earth's crust to create motion and drag on the continents to move.
20 seconds.
Thank you. And there's a couple variations on that. I'm going to go with this one because the others to me are untenable anyway. We can talk about them, but what we're ultimately going to do is we'll get to this point. This is called a free body diagram, and I'll explain that later. I'll go ahead and yield my time so that Mark can take his turn.
Okay, TRock, thank you for that opening statement. I'm now going to reset the timer. Mark Reid, you've got between 12 and 13 minutes, we'll say, for an opening statement in order to provide equal time. And so whenever you're ready, just let me know. If you need to screen share, I can get that up there for you as well.
Sure. Give me 1 second, and I'll just share my screen. Thank you, Donny. Just 1 sec.
No problem.
Okay.
You're
John,
good
when
to
you got
go,
it up
Mark.
on the screen. Oh,
Yeah,
fantastic. Thank you. And thanks, everybody. It's great to be here. Thanks to Donny and TRock for being here. And thank you for your time. I want to sort of touch on what I'm going to be doing here. I just want to go over some really commonplace things, and we'll get some scientific answers from TRock about how all this all happened, because the flood myth contained in the Bible was about the 3rd millennium BCE, but it's not drawn from one source. It came from 2 sources, of priestly and non-priestly. And there are some massive problems with the flood, a global flood. Now, no one's saying that local floods don't happen. Local floods happen. Everybody, nobody disagrees on that. But the whole point of a global flood and how it's written in the Bible isn't accurate scientifically. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that this isn't the only flood mythology from the area. The old Babylonian period shows that there was the Epic of Ziusudra, followed by the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh, both written in the Akkadian language. There's parallels between these 2 stories that can't be ignored. So let's look at these parallels. There's so many similarities between the 2 that it's very strange that they both are described 1 door, 1 window. They're both described as releasing birds. They're both described sort of, these resemblances are uncanny to how many things are the same between the 2. This narrative, although it's sort of similar, it's not the same. And so it's probably a myth that's been made up and then passed along that bears no resemblance to the original event. Now, unaffected cultures, this isn't a coincidence. That all these cultures throughout the world, they're completely unaffected. The Shangxi in China was notoriously unaffected by any flood at the time. The Jomon period in Japan went straight through this, no break in any kind of civilization. We know this from archaeological digs. There's also things that even happened in the region. The Egypt in the 5th dynasty reigned from sort of 2465 BCE. Apparently, the flood was 2345 BCE and it ended in 2344. So, how did the Egyptians be unaffected? The Harappan civilization in India, which was 2300 to 1900 BC, that went straight through the flood and ironically had a drought somewhere in the middle of there. And sort of there's all these civilizations which were absolutely unaffected by the flood, and we know they were because there was no break in their civilization for the period. And now there are a number of problems, and I want TRock to address all of these problems and explain how they work scientifically. The first one's the engineering. This is torsion. There is no wooden boat that exists that does not have intake of water due to this torsion. The rolling waves, there was a ship called the Wyoming. It was the size of the Ark. It had bilge pumps and eventually floundered. There are barges that are the size of the Ark that are wooden. They need bilge pumps because water keeps coming in and they fill up with water and sink. So unless somehow they had bilge pumps back then you would have to have multiple people bailing the water out or pumping the water out somehow before the pump was invented. How does this happen? How did all the animals fit on the Ark? A conservative estimate is 35,000. How did 8 people take care of the animals, do maintenance, cooking, cleaning, dung, taking the dung out, sleeping, eating, caring for the animals? Did they have time to socialize? Did they have time to do anything else? How did it care for oblate carnivores? How did it get the eucalyptus leaves for koalas? How did it get the bamboo for pandas? All of this that TRock will have to account for. How did that happen? The animal migration problem. How did animals get from their country of origin back to the Ark? To the Ark and back. How did koalas walk all the way into the Middle East and then all the way back with no eucalyptus to eat anywhere in between? How did the sloth get from South America all the way to the Middle East and then all the way back when its land speed is something like 1.5 meters a minute? This is stuff that has to be accounted for. None of the animals died on the way, obviously, because, you know, they wouldn't be here if one of them died out of the two. But no fossils were left anywhere in between, even though it might have taken several lifetimes to make that trip. That's weird. There's a population problem. The Tower of Babel happened 100 years after the flood. 8 people. How did 8 people reproduce enough to make a population to build the most massive tower in history in 100 years? The first Mesopotamian Empire was 138 years after the flood. How did 138 years later 8 people turn into about 1.5 million? How did that happen? You've got to account for this somehow. And this is a civilization, by the way, that we found has no break in it due to a flood. It existed all throughout that sort of empire. It started then, but it was the people of Sumna that were there beforehand, and they didn't have any flood recorded. So those 5 questions should be enough to get on, but I do want scientific answers to them. And I've mentioned that there's hundreds of more problems like this with the flood narrative. I don't have time to go through them all. Now, I concede that it's plausible a local flood occurred at some point in the Middle East, and its story was written down and passed along and then made bigger and more grandiose by the people taking the story down. But that doesn't mean the flood story is accurate as it's said in the Bible. We have to come up with scientific explanations for this if you are to say that this story is scientific. Because if you can't come up with scientific explanations, then what you have is an unscientific story. Maybe true, but it's certainly not scientific. Was the rainbow the first rainbow ever put in the sky? There's a good question. How does light work if before rainbows there was no light making rainbows? It's an interesting question. One that TRock will have to answer scientifically. But thank you for listening. I'll turn it back to Donny, and we can get started on the rebuttals. Thank you.
Mark Reid, thank you very much for that opening presentation. Mark and TRock, that concludes the opening statements for tonight's debate. I appreciate the visuals and the work put into creating those presentations. So let's move into our 8-minute uninterrupted rebuttal. TRock, before I do hand it to you, I'll let the audience know that I am all caught up on questions. And so I appreciate the questions coming in. Again, if you do have a question for the debaters, let me know who the question is for. And then just tag me at Donny or at Standing for Truth. Okay, TRock, whenever you're ready, you have an 8-minute rebuttal, and I'll start your timer on your first word.
Okay, thank you. Mark was kind enough to thank Donny and myself for participating, so I want to return the gesture. Thank you, Mark, for joining the discussion. But I will say that the title of this debate is there scientific evidence for a worldwide flood? And Mark has brought a bunch of issues with the ark, but this isn't about the ark. It's about the nature of a worldwide flood. So you can see that we prepared very differently for this, and I'm honestly not sure why Mark wasn't interested in talking about the nature of the flood on the globe as opposed to the ark. I don't know that I'll spend a whole lot of time trying to rebut what he presented, because this is supposed to be about the flood, not the ark. But nevertheless, I will take a brief moment and answer at least a couple of the questions that he tried to pose. So he talked about uninterrupted civilizations that were completely unaffected by the flood. That would be true if you subscribed and put any confidence in the secular dating schemes of those civilizations. 14,000 BCE, I think, is what one of those dates gave, which there's no way on earth anybody in modern history could accurately calculate a date for anything that far back. So the ark itself, he talked about engineering problems very briefly. I'm just going to say I'm honestly surprised that especially people like Mark, I deem him to be an extremely intelligent individual, should be well studied, does not appear to be on this particular point to understand that This is a continual problem with critics to compare the Ark to the Wyoming. The Wyoming was a sailing vessel with a mast on it. Yes, all ships have torsion issues, but a mast on a sailing ship significantly increases the amount of torsion and other types of stresses that are on a wooden vessel. The Ark did not have a mast. It would have absolutely had some torsional issues, but not like the Wyoming. So there is no reason to try and make that some kind of parallel example that the Ark has to contend with, because it's just absolutely not. So I'm going to kind of, I'll touch briefly, I guess, on the Epic of Gilgamesh. Very poor scholarly investigation to claim that the Epic of Gilgamesh precedes the biblical account, if only for one very important reason. When you find ancient documents in any form, whether they're on parchments or carved into rock or carved into wood, it doesn't matter. You cannot tell by looking at them whether you have the original or not. We do know in the case of the biblical documents that have been found on the flood, we do not have the original. That's actually very important in this argument, because all you know is you have a copy of something. It could be the original, but you wouldn't necessarily know it. In the case of the Bible, we actually do know that we don't have the originals because they're all on parchments that have been edited in some way. And redacted, I think, is the term that would be used in literature. But either way, the problem, of course, is if we've got a copy of the biblical account, you still don't know how old the original is. So you still have no logical way of determining whether the Epic of Gilgamesh actually preceded it by simple dating methods. Instead, you would have to do a very strong textual criticism. And it is quite obvious that there is some very profound similarities between the two. So much so that the biblical account was the only one that was really known of in the modern world for a very long time, until recent era when the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered, and people just blew up over how similar it was. It was extremely surprising. But in the textual criticism, what you find is that the Epic of Gilgamesh looks very much like an entertainment document that was corrupted heavily on purpose. That is not at all what the biblical account looks like. It has reasonable dimensions for the ark. It has reasonable timelines for a global flood to take place. It has a reasonable approach to survival. It has 8 normal human beings doing the work, at least most of it. Everything about it is a reasonable, straightforward historical account. Everything about Gilgamesh screams that somebody just wanted to be entertaining and probably wrote it down post hoc as, a way to get attention or something. So, no, the Epic of Gilgamesh does not precede the flood by any amount. It's the other way around. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the geology now, because Mark didn't really try to address any of that. I want to talk a little bit about the current tectonic theory, because when you look at the rock record, of course, we all know that there are very, very deep rock formations from water transit. It's mostly in marine and environment, especially dolostone, limestones, sandstones, that kind of stuff. Very deep, very thick, very pure, homogeneous for the type of rock that it is. And a lot of it, as I pointed out in the intro, is at a significantly high altitude today. So the standard explanation for how those things get at such high altitudes is plate tectonics. So that's why I want to talk about that for a little bit. The standard theory says that you've got currents, thermal currents going up and down that basically cause the seafloor to sink, or slabs of the crust at the very least to sink down. And you've got other places where mountain forming from hot plumes coming up from the mantle. Also putting a lot of stress on the crust, and therefore creating drag forces across the mantle by the crust and the continents. The big, huge problem that I'm going to point out with that is that tensile strength of concrete is like really, really low. And when you compare, I also compared it to granites and to basalt to see if there was any significant difference there. And the short story is There is not. They also have very low tensile strength. So the material properties that they are relying on to drag the continents, or even the self-weight of the crust without the continent, is so weak that the modern theory of plate tectonics is completely broken and does not work. Sorry, I'm going to shut my phone off here. Okay, I think I've got about a minute left here. So anyway, the material properties are just not there to go around trying to drag the continents, nor are they there to try and push the continents. One of the first things you learn in engineering is that concrete is very strong in compression, but very weak in tensile. Now, if somebody said, okay, pushing mechanism, that has been said in the open literature, pushing forces instead of pulling forces. Okay, problem there, of course, is that the seafloor is very unlevel, and pushing on a large slab of any type of rock is just going to break it before it moves something very heavy. So I'm going to go ahead and yield my time, and so we can move on with the discussion.
Okay. TRock, thank you very much for the 8-minute rebuttal. We're now going to hand it back to Mark Reid. Mark, whenever you're ready, you also have 8 minutes for a rebuttal, and I'll start the timer on your first word. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. So what's funny is that sort of, TRock sort of said I didn't address the problems, and he sort of brought up the formation of the moon in a flood debate, which for some reason I don't even get the connection. It's got nothing to do with the flood or the flood story or anything to do with it. I really have no idea why he brought it up. Really shaken up. He said this impact adds heat to the equation. It's like, well, very strange that you sort of will bring up the heat problem that the creationists have, because the RATE project has already said that they haven't solved the heat problem. If you can solve the heat problem of the short timeline of the sort of 10,000 years or 6,000 years or whatever you believe the Earth is, go for it. I'd love to hear at this stream all of your equations to solve that heat problem. Would be fantastic. And so the lighter debris going to the top, I'm not sure how that applies to sort of plate tectonics and everything that you were saying. You were sort of inferring that it was to do with water, and yeah, that's true. But we see some sedimentary layers sort of below some other layers of metamorphic rock and things like that, where, for instance, it has been sort of compressed. So the heat concept, water being present, just all this thing about the water thing. I don't like, if you find areas where we can see evidence of water being there, yeah, there's probably been a flood, but just pointing out that there's been a flood somewhere doesn't get you to a global flood. That's why I'm sort of saying the scientific evidence for a global flood, the entire thing. Just saying there's been a flood doesn't get you there. I'm sorry, TRock, it just doesn't. So and the whole thing of the water completely covering the Earth at the top, like, you realize there are mountains and valleys and higher land and lower land. So your weird diagram where it's completely smooth and the water's covering all of it isn't realistic, because the Earth isn't 100% smooth, as you've probably seen if you've ever seen, I don't know, a hill. So this entire idea of this is what the water would do, I don't know where you get that from. I've got no idea. The fluid flow in, the whole idea of fluid flow, but we also have things called entrenched meanders, right? Entrenched meanders are when a river or a canyon doubles back on itself almost 180 degrees. What I'd like to know from TRock is if he's saying that this was caused by hydraulic erosion, i.e. the water being added to it, how does that get 180 degree meander? Because if you have water going in one direction, it will not do that. This can only be caused over sort of sediments being moved across that surface over a large amount of time. So I'd love to know his answer to that one. So the whole thing is that TRock's acting like sort of erosion by water is the only, or hydraulic erosion is the only one out there, but there's not. There's mechanical erosion. You get erosion by wind. You get erosion by sort of moving sediments from other methods as well. There isn't just one method of erosion. So some of the things he sort of touched on can be explained by mechanical rather than hydraulic erosion. The geologic column, it's interesting that he brings that up. There's no evidence of a flood in there. In fact, quite the opposite. You get areas of something called tuff, which is volcanic ash that's been compressed. The problem with this is if there was water there, it wouldn't form. So how does he explain this scientifically? The sediment, like the size of particles and the depth, I'm not sure where. To be honest with you, I wasn't sure where he was going with a lot of this. He just seemed to say, hey, particles be small, therefore flood, which particles can be small due to hydraulic erosion. Sure, but it doesn't get you to a worldwide flood. How do you figure that? I'm not sure what he was on about with Deep Springs, California. I mean, as far as I know, it's an artisanal basin. I don't know much more about what his point was about that. Like, and plate tectonics. Now, sort of, he said that it sort of is due to the what's in the lithosphere. That's not quite correct. It's due to the lithosphere and the ionosphere. It's the convection currents by the magma, not lava, magma under there that cause continents to shift. And if earthquakes are not caused by plate tectonics, what are they caused by? Like maybe TRock can share with us all of the geological knowledge of what causes uplift, subduction, seafloor spreading, and earthquakes, maybe, if that's not the explanation. So I'll be looking forward to TRock's scientific explanation of all of those things if plate tectonics isn't a thing. And also, he sort of said I didn't bring up any of the geological stuff. Sure, I could have. But we're not just talking about geological flood, we're talking about a worldwide flood. So these are still problems that I brought up with a worldwide flood. It's not just about the ark, and this isn't just about a flood. It's about the story of the flood in the Bible, the global flood where a dude got in a boat with animals and sailed, floated around for a while. So I think those have to be addressed. You have to back up your narrative in the Bible, not just the idea there was a global flood. So yeah, I'm completely on topic. It's just with the formation of the moon, you're the one that's not, TRock. Thank you.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much for that 8-minute rebuttal. We've now concluded, gentlemen, the opening statements and the rebuttals. Lots of great points on the table for us to discuss and engage for the next 50 to 60 minutes. So before I give you both the floor to the audience, since we are going to be having close to an hour worth of discussion, make sure you're tagging me with your Genesis flood related questions. And so Mark just ended with his rebuttal. And therefore, TRock, let's give you the opportunity to pick the first topic or first point to discuss. Go ahead, gentlemen.
Okay. Per the norm, and I get it, I'm not trying to beat Mark up over this, but people don't follow the thought process because you learn to think about it in such a different way for so long that it's hard to put it all together. And 12 minutes is not enough to really put together a comprehensive presentation. But the reason I brought the impact theory for the moon in was because with that, the current paradigm says that the Earth was a hot molten mass for an extended period of time, and
Yeah,
in part it's because of the impact, right?
Well, one thing you did get wrong, I do have to correct. You said the moon hit the Earth, and that's not true. That's not what the hypothesis or the theory says. It's that another planetoid called Theia hit the moon, and or hit the Earth, sorry, and that's what sort of split off a part of the Earth. That's what it says. So
no, you're totally correct. You're totally correct. I said moon. Planetesimal is the correct description of what they think happened. Either way, it's a very large mass striking the Earth, right? So
yeah.
The point there is that with the molten mass of the Earth and water present at the same time, the water is by default pushed to the surface globally.
What water?
Are you telling me? When are you suggesting water came to you?
How? Well, I mean, it's water's sort of H2O, so the elements for water may have been there. But if you're talking about the Earth in a molten state, like the formation of the solar system, there wasn't liquid water on the Earth at that point. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. How can the Earth be molten? How can the Earth be molten and have water on it? How is that possible?
Again, you're going to have to tell me, if it didn't come during the incident of this planetesimal striking the Earth, when did the water get to the Earth?
Well, I believe there's a number of hypotheses on that. I mean, it could have been in a gaseous state, like, steam. It could have been delivered by a comet, like carrying ice. That could have happened, yeah.
So I'm familiar with the comet theory, and that was actually discarded, I believe, by scientists a long time ago. I mean, if you have some information different than that, that's great. But I'm going to assume that there was at least some water in the material that composed the Earth and or the planetesimal that struck the Earth. And so the point there then becomes that at this point, because the Earth is a hot molten mass, it doesn't matter whether it's a gaseous vapor. That's even worse. It basically, whatever it is that the water came from, had to start out on the surface. And because it's on the surface, the whole point of bringing that up is that you have a global flood because of the dynamics you chose to explain the formation of the Earth, whether you like it or not. That's what the physics would do to it.
Well, I think you're sort of misconstruing what's happening here, because, I mean, water's just H2O, right? So your assumption that there was liquid water on the surface of the Earth is incorrect as far as mainstream geology and astronomy and sort of, planetary physics is concerned. I think that sort of the thing that may have happened is it may have been hydrogen, which is abundantly common throughout the universe, and that sort of comets and asteroids and things struck, bringing some sort of oxygen to the surface of the Earth. Now, with the sort of cooling of the Earth afterwards, there could be condensation, which caused sort of these things to form, water to form. But I think that you're assuming that on a molten Earth, it boggles my mind that they're assuming on a molten Earth, one that is essentially just a ball of lava and magma, it's going to have water, is really weird.
The point is that if there is any water in the minerals whatsoever, it boils to the surface in some form. It boils to the surface.
If it boils, it's not water anymore. It's a gas. It's steam.
Until it gets to the top and condenses again.
Well, yeah, but if the surface is magma, right? If the surface is lava, if it's that hot, it's not going to condense again until that situation cools down. So your entire premise is that this molten ball had stuff cooling on it that could never possibly cool.
So no, that's actually not true, because it can come up, it can go up into the atmosphere and come back down again and go through cooling cycles. But besides that, if you start with hydrogen is flammable. If it gets anywhere near the any of the hot molten state of the Earth in its early formation, all it does is catches on fire and burns up.
Not if it's locked in a sort of some kind of compound that's not flammable.
And then how does it get released from that compound?
I don't know, possibly heat, possibly the impact with comets or meteorites. I don't. But see, this is going off on a way massive tangent on, like, how did the Earth get its moon kind of. I don't understand what this has got to do with the flood.
The whole point is to establish that in the current paradigm, you've got this weird dynamic on how the Earth formed, and no matter how you slice it, you end up with water at the surface.
This isn't about the moon.
It's about a global flood. It's about a global flood, and I'm getting you to the point where you have a global flood in your history due to the physics that you chose, or due to not the physics.
So does the Bible say that God? Does the Bible say that God launched a Thea at the Earth and it broke off the moon? Is there something about that story that I missed, or was the moon already around?
That's way outside the scope of this discussion. All I'm pointing out is that
outside the scope of the discussion. I'm talking about the actual flood narrative in the book.
You're not a theologian. You're not a theologian. I'm talking about the science, because you're supposed to represent the scientific side.
Can we get back on the subject of the flood and not
I'm getting you there.
Not whatever.
I am
you're getting nowhere, TRock. Donny, can we get back on subject, please, of the flood and not sort of, you know, TRock's moon mythology he's coming up with here.
All right, gentlemen, so we just hit the 7-minute mark, and I really want us to utilize our 60 minutes of discussion. So TRock, let's hand it back to you. And since you being the affirmative on the question, is there scientific evidence for worldwide flood? Maybe pick a line of evidence for the flood, something that you believe supports a worldwide flood, and then we'll go back and forth with it.
Okay, so one of the things I brought up in my one of my previous debates had to do, and I mentioned this earlier, has to do with the thickness of obviously marine sediments, right? So one of the really important points about the sediments, also something I touched on in my intro. If you have, for example, 10 feet of sediments that are already deposited and they're currently on dry land, it took a lot more than 10 feet of water to put them there. A lot more. So when we look at the geologic column and we see you know, limestone formations, sandstone formations, dolostone formations, even mud flows, but when we see the thicker ones that are in the hundreds of meters thick, it took a lot more volume of water than just simply looking at that height. And they are currently at, a lot of them are at very high elevations. That's the point of the Deep Springs Valley example, was that they're very high elevations, very thick Cambrian deposits. And it takes a lot more water than the thickness of those deposits to put them there.
Yeah, they're once underwater. Like, so for instance, the White Cliffs of Dover, which is the famous sort of, you know, carboniferous formation, it basically has organisms that used to live underwater. And sort of as the tectonic plates move, they are raised above the water, and then areas that were previously above water go underwater. And all of this is very well understood. And you sort of questioned whether plate tectonics was correct or not. So maybe you could address how you explain seaforce spreading, subduction zones, earthquakes, and uplifts. Maybe you can explain all of that for us.
Oh, absolutely. Donnie, I'm
Sure.
going to share my screen
What is
again.
that?
Let me know. Okay, I'm still
sharing.
there. Okay, can you see this?
What's the emphasis mine? What is that?
Okay. I just want a quick confirmation, but that is essentially it. Let me back up one slide. Plate tectonics and continental movement. Okay, so this comes from Encyclopedia Britannica. It is an evolutionary friendly source, of course. They basically are just a compilation of scientific information. But it says, as the lithospheric plates move across Earth's surface, driven by forces as yet not fully understood, they interact along their boundaries, diverging, converging, or slipping past each other. I'm just saying that I put the bold text in there, emphasizing that it is exact opposite of what you just said a few minutes ago. You said it's very well understood, not according to the mainstream literature. It's not yet fully understood. The process of plate tectonics may be driven by convection in Earth's mantle, the pull of heavy old pieces of crust into the mantle, or some combination of both. For a deeper discussion.
So I'll just because you've brought up a sort of accusation, I'll clarify what I meant. The fact that plates are moving is very well understood. Like, you've sort of quote mined that, because what that article says, which is your own article, says plate tectonics, the theory of dealing with the Earth's outer shell, revolutionized Earth, provided context to understanding mountain building protests, volcanoes, earthquakes, as well as the evolution of surface and reconstructing its past in the ocean. So it basically says that is true. Your own article.
It says that what's true?
That plate tectonics is true. It's saying that
let me clarify something
behind. Hang on. It's saying that the forces behind the convection currents isn't well understood, but we understand plate tectonics really well.
Okay, Mark, let me clarify something that you completely misrepresented on me earlier. You basically said that I don't think plate tectonics is a thing, and that is not at all what I am saying here. The plates are moving. There are 7 global plates and then several smaller plates. They're all moving. That is not in contention here whatsoever.
Okay. Then why are they moving?
That is the point. That is the point of this discussion.
Why are they moving?
They are moving because the global flood happened and the continents moved first, not the plates dragging the continents.
So do you have scientific evidence for this?
Yeah.
All right, where's the scientific evidence?
And I'm kind of driving it in reverse
global
here.
Flood. Well, where's the scientific evidence that the global flood caused the continents to move, which dragged the plates behind them?
Yes, and that's what this whole discussion tonight is about, the scientific
so
evidence.
If you could show that instead of sort of moving on to my worldview, because you have yours. Like, you're trying to put it back on me, and I don't understand.
I'm not trying
Just
to
give
put
us the scientific evidence for yours.
Mark, I'm not trying to put it back on you. I'm trying to explain to you
Yes,
that there are basically, in my estimation, two options to choose from for how the plates are moving. It's either the standard paradigm, and if it's not it, which is the scientific evidence I'm fixing to show, if it's not it, it's something else. That's the starting point for building the case for scientific evidence for a global flood.
You're not arguing for something else. You're arguing for the flood specifically. That's the thing, TRock. You are not arguing for something else. You're arguing for the flood specific. I mean, it could be dancing leprechauns that are pushing the plates, but you're not arguing for that. You're arguing for the flood. So show your evidence for the flood.
I am showing you the evidence. You keep interrupting.
No, you're just saying what's wrong with the conventional worldview.
The heat source for convection is thought to be the decay of radiometric elements in the mantle. Stop right there for just a second, because it is what is fairly well understood, and you can ask Lawrence Krauss about this, since he's an evolutionary physicist, or an evolutionist that is a physicist, I'll put it that way. He has plainly said that the majority of the radioactive elements are in the crust, not the mantle, and they're not heating up and causing convection currents in the crust today. So how could they have that effect in the mantle, especially if they're not affected by external heat and energy and other types of sources, and they have constant rates of decay? It's so slow, it's not even doing anything to the crust. Okay.
You're waiting on that scientific evidence.
How this convection propels the plates is poorly understood. Poorly understood. How this convection propels the plates.
Yes.
They don't understand
so we know
how
about
that
the convection.
And I'm going to show you why it is that it's poorly understood. In the Western Pacific Ocean, the subduction of old dense oceanic crust may be self-propelled. Not sure what that's supposed to mean. They move themselves. The weight of the subducted slab may drag the rest of the plate toward the trench, a process known as slab pull.
Yes, so gravity. So do you understand that when subduction happens, one goes low and the other one gets pushed up, and that's how mountain ranges are formed? So the one that's going low, if there is enough mass there to pull it down with gravity, then it will start to drag, and that's what it's talking about.
Okay, Mark, to be clear, I am not contesting the idea that mountains are formed by plate movement. I'm not.
Yes, but you've got to show that with scientific evidence that a flood is actually causing that. So if you could show that instead of sidetracking, show that evidence that a flood is what's causing these plates to move.
It's not sidetracking, Mark. It's called building a case, and you're not being patient enough to see it built.
Well, you're not getting to any evidence. That's the thing. You keep saying you will, but you don't.
You expect it to happen in 30 seconds?
Well, I expect you to be relevant to the conversation, yeah.
I expect you to understand that this is very relevant, but you don't. The weight of the subducted slab may drag the rest of the plate forward, called slab pull, much as a tablecloth will pull itself off a table if more than half of the cloth is draped over the table's edge. Okay, now, that was the purpose for this diagram that I briefly showed. This is a very rough version of what we would call in engineering a free body diagram. So the black line that you see there is representative of the crust and suboceanic, of course. So the green is representative of a continent that rises up out of the water above, obviously above the mountain ranges that are in the ocean. So black line's the crust, the green is the continent, and the arrows are showing the vector forces that are supposedly at play in order to move the continents and the plates themselves. So what you have here is, of course, the continents put a massive amount of downward force directly onto the rest of the crust below it. which is then in contact with the mantle below it. And so what happens there is there will be what's called a coefficient of friction that describes the friction between the mantle and the crust above it, right? There is a force to overcome from friction for that. And even if you call it gravitational dragging, which is not what the theory states, but even if you call it that, we'll still see a problem with it here in a minute. Now, the arrows down represent the gravity of the continent. This arrow right here represents the force, the coefficient of friction. So you take that, multiply it times the force of the weight of the continent coming down, and that gives you the resistive force of the continent moving.
Well,
over here,
no, I've got to interrupt you. You've completely misunderstood it, mate. It's not the gravity acting on the continent. It's gravity acting on the area that's already been subducted, right?
No, Mark, I didn't misunderstand gravity.
No. The way it said that a tablecloth is draped over something and the weight of that tablecloth keeps pulling it down, it's talking about the subduction zone, not whatever you've drawn up here.
We're getting there, Mark. If you don't know what a free body diagram is, you're going to have to listen for a minute and figure out what it is.
Okay, well, I don't see how you drawing a diagram with paint.
I know you don't, because you haven't done the physics to know whether the standard paradigm works or not.
Have you done the physics?
That's what I'm doing here. That's what I'm doing here.
That's not physics. Physics is calculations, TRock. That's you drawing a diagram in paint. That is what that is.
Okay, I will continue. This right here is a valley in the ocean floor, for example. And so part of the paradigm says that cold slabs are pulled down due to differences in density. And over here is a mountain, submarine mountain, that the paradigm says that thermal plumes push up, right? So there's a force that pushes this up, and there's a force that pushes this down. And what happens here is, see this very crude idea of a triangle right here? In standard physics, you take the downward force, you take the angle that the thing is moving, and you use basic trigonometry to figure out what the lateral force is that can overcome the coefficient of friction that exists because of the weight of the continent on the mantle. So this angle produces a lateral force in the horizontal direction to help with this pulling. That's what the standard paradigm is about. This, on the other hand, it does something very different, because when you have a hot plume coming up, it pushes in both directions, so it doesn't necessarily add very much to the dragging force that's supposed to move the continent. So,
okay. All right, we've seen your diagram. What I'll do is I'll put up an actual diagram of the thing. If I could share my screen, Donny, and show people that how insanely wrong what he's saying is. Because he's trying to describe, this is a straw man of what the actual thing is. This is the actual diagram of what's happening with the convection currents. Now, things aren't pushed up. What happens is, with seafloor spreading, those plates move apart. Rising magma fills it to form new crust, right? So the whole idea it's being pushed, no, that's completely incorrect. Totally incorrect. This slab pull is what they're talking about in the article that he read out, where, like a tablecloth, if you get enough crust over the edge, it will keep pulling this, even though there may be insufficient convection to make it pull on the own. And the suction also can help as well. But this is happening underwater. The continent's not weighing down the thing. So the diagram is completely and utterly incorrect, and it's quite frankly embarrassing how incorrect it is. Like the whole idea that the plate's being boiled up somehow by whatever it is that he's got drawn in paint on there, and the whole idea that the continent's weighing it down. So no, that is not how any of this works. It is completely and utterly wrong. It is, and this is what they're talking about, TRock. The plates are being subducted causes that pull. So you've quote mined one thing out of a Encyclopedia Britannica thing. You've applied it mistakenly, made a paint document of what you think it is, and then said, hey, that's the truth. No, it's not. Like, you are misrepresenting the actual science in the most heinous way possible.
Are you ready for me to respond?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, I'm going to show my screen one more time because, Mark, what you showed was a theory diagram, not a physics-free body diagram. There is a huge difference.
Yours isn't even a diagram. It's a paint. It's a paint-like scribble.
Okay. Now I'm going to show you why
Really,
it is
back to
that
MS
all that noise that you just went through is a bunch of nonsense because it has nothing to do with actual physics. It's a theory.
Oh, really?
At best.
Okay.
Okay. So here are 4 terms I want to introduce real quick. Coefficient of friction. I kind of talked about that. Tensile strength. That's going to be the big one. And then deformation and failure. So the only other thing.
Are you looking to share screen, TRock, or no?
Oh, my apologies. Yeah.
Back to MS Paint. Back to MS Paint.
Okay. Coefficient of friction, tensile strength, deformation, and failure. So I talked about coefficient of friction. It's basically how much friction is produced between any 2 surfaces. So something like the friction between, say, it doesn't matter, rubber and ice between 2 different rocks, they're going to be very different values, and they're dependent on what those 2 materials are. And that's what determines the pulling force necessary to move a continent. And we're talking about the crust contact with the mantle specifically. So even though the mantle is molten, there's still a coefficient of friction that has to be overcome. So the next thing I want to point out here, tensile strength. So this is engineering and physics, Mark, physics 101. Concrete has a tensile strength of 300 to 700 psi. As I said in my intro, the very first thing you learn in engineering is that concrete is really good in compression, very, very poor in tension. Granite, it's much better than concrete, but it's not that great. It gets up to around 3,600 psi for tensile strength. Basalt is even better, up to 4,350 psi. Look what steel is, 65,000, and I have 75. That's maybe not totally accurate. Should look more like 72,000, but either way.
Well, I mean, regardless, I think we're going way off the beaten track here, because that's sort of, the tensile strength at room temperature. We're talking about sort of rocks that are subject to heating. So
which makes it even
I don't
lower.
Understand how
which makes it even lower, Mark.
Scientific, which I don't understand as makes any difference to the scientific evidence presented. Like, you're not presenting any scientific evidence. You're making claims based upon your own erroneous beliefs about the science that has been done. I mean, how do you explain, like, you've already admitted that plate tectonics is a thing. So, I don't know where this gets you. Like, how, like, I'm not saying that, hey, you've got to show scientific evidence for plate tectonics. I'm saying you've got to show scientific evidence that plate tectonics is in fact caused by the water of the flood. That's what I need you to scientifically demonstrate.
So again, it is quite obvious that you pull up cartoonish theory diagrams, not physics, and so you don't want the scientific approach. The scientific approach is a lot more complicated than showing a meme.
What are you talking about? Who did that diagram, TRock?
The scientific method is a lot more complicated than a meme.
What scientist did that diagram, TRock? Your diagram.
Which scientists did these tensile strengths, and what do they mean to the very high elevation of Cambrian strata? That's the whole point.
No, who did your diagram, TRock?
I did.
You did. So you wrote it down on a piece of paper, and you're saying mine's cartoonish. That's hilariously ironic. But none of this is sort of to do with the flood. You're just deflecting onto, well, I want to talk about rocks, so I don't have to talk about the flood. You haven't done anything to show any evidence. Mark, after all of that talking. You haven't even shown a shred of evidence.
You have slowed me down so much with that rambling that we're never going to get there.
For the flood.
No, you're not.
What's the evidence for the flood? Why are you dodging and ducking and deflecting? What is the evidence that the flood causes plate tectonic? Plate tectonics is not under discussion. You agree to it. I agree to it. Then why are you going over it and over it and over it? What is the evidence that water caused it? Now, go, show it.
Okay, you are the one, Mark, that plainly stated, rewind this video after we're done, you plainly stated that tectonic movement brought chalk layers in Cambrian strata above sea level.
Sure.
You are the one that said that. And I'm referencing you to Deep Spring Valley, California, very high elevation Cambrian strata.
Sure.
And showing you that plate tectonics did not in the standard paradigm, continental movement did, yes, but
Continental
not the
movement did.
standard, not the standard paradigm of continental drift and plate tectonics did not bring it up there.
So, ladies and gentlemen, what we've heard from TRock is that, yeah, continental drift, basically plate tectonics, brought this to a higher elevation, but it wasn't the normal, like, accepted scientific researched reasons. It was the flood. Why? No answer whatsoever as to why this is. Just, you're wrong because I'm right. That's essentially what he said. Now, I'd like to get onto some of the things that I brought up, because I did bring up a lot, and I think it's only fair because we've dilly-dallied along on this topic for ages, that you ducked and dodged and dived and everything like that. So I'd like to know how many animals were there on the ark, TRock. How many animals?
I'm going to finish my thought because this is very pointed to directly answer your question. Tensile strength, very low in granite and basalt. Those are the most relevant. The whole point is that you cannot pull a continent with concrete, granite, or basalt. It will just break apart. So whatever it is in terms of continental movement that put that Cambrian stratus so high above sea elevation, it was not the standard paradigm of very slow and gradual pushing and pulling from thermal currents under in the mantle. That does not work. Physics does not allow that to happen. So what did cause it to happen? Rapid movement. Rapid. That is the key. It had to have been rapid.
Okay, I'll address this, and then I want to move on from this silly topic, because it's just like you aren't actually giving any evidence for water doing it. The PSI, what does it mean? It means pounds per square inch, right? So it's basically a measure of how much force is over 1 inch. Now, we're talking about a plate that is so massive, and it's an even distribution over that entire plate, because the tectonic currents, they move in a circle. All of that is providing the force across, but it's not in 1 inch like TRock is trying to make out, because he sort of said, oh, but per square inch, it won't handle that force. But it's not on an inch, TRock. It's over an entire continent, which means that the force that it can handle is incredible.
No, Mark, you completely misrepresented my point. I am not at all pretending this is across 1 square inch. I come from an engineering background. I'm fully aware that the correct way to apply this information is to go across the cross-sectional area of the ocean floor where the crust is that's supposedly dragging the continent.
So how much force could a continent handle? How much force could a continent handle?
The whole point here, Mark, is that
how much force could a continent handle? How much force could a continent handle? How much force could a continent handle?
What does that mean? What is it?
Well, you're trying to say that the force was too big, that the continent couldn't handle it and would break apart. So how much force?
I didn't say the continent would break apart.
Well, then you don't have anything to say, because
you don't seem to be able to get anything I say correct, Mark.
No, you're just making silly statements about PSI when it's misapplied to a continent. Like, you're talking about continental drift, not like putting something on the back of your car and towing it. It has to be spread out beyond all of what is the PSI of that convection current that we're talking about? What is it?
It's pretty low, and it doesn't matter what it is. This is the point. Yeah. Is the continent connected to a rigid crust? Yes or no? Huh?
Sorry?
Is the continent connected to a rigid crust?
It is the crust.
The continent is the crust?
Yes, continental crust, yes.
I didn't say
as
continental
opposed to deep sea crust.
The convection currents are supposedly pulling from, for example, in one instance, the Pacific Ocean. The currents are pulling from the Pacific Ocean. They're dragging from the Pacific Ocean. That means that they have to have a rigid body across them that connects them to the continent to drag the continent with it via these currents that you're describing.
No, it's not pushing it. It's in the Pacific there's seafloor spreading. It's moving apart.
Actually, that's funny you say that, because the paradigm, actually, there are multiple views on this. Some do say pushing and some say pulling. There's actually,
well, it's
and this, what I'm showing you here is exactly
this is your misunderstanding. It's over the entire
exactly
plate.
Why there's differences of opinion in the
it's over the entire plate. No, there isn't. It's over the entire plate that convection currents, because the entire current is over the entire plate. And you can say on some plates there's slab pull where it is being subducted, but that doesn't mean to say it's being pushed or pulled. It's like, it's such a weird way to phrase it. But I'd like to get away from this and onto my questions, because you've completely dominated this entire subject because of your weird kind of, misunderstandings of geology. I'd like to get onto how many animals were on the ark. How many animals were on there?
Okay, Mark, I'll entertain your deal since you can't do science and actually crunch some numbers. We can talk about the ark for a minute. How many animals? Estimates range from, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 up to 10,000 or 12,000, maybe a little higher. It's just an estimate. We don't have a real good idea, but it's in that ballpark.
How many animals were on there? Like, so you don't know?
Personally, of course we don't know. Did anybody write it down to tell us? Has any scientist gone back and counted?
Well,
did anybody in history document it?
2 pairs. Yeah, apparently it was 2 pairs of every kind.
No.
And 7 of the unclean. Oh, the clean kind, sorry. Yeah.
7 pairs of all the clean, yes, making 14. And interestingly, they're very low percentage of clean animals.
Were there insects on the ark?
No. Why would you think that?
Okay, no insects on the ark, and everything else was underwater. Is that right?
That's another really good point, because part of the whole thing about the global flood is it is not a 1-year inundation. It is a 1-year process. We don't know exactly what length of time the entire planet was underwater, but I would estimate as low as a couple weeks, as high as maybe 2 months.
Well, I don't get it, because the Bible says the entire world was covered and only the tips of the mountains started to show after 10 months. So if you could illuminate me on that.
Yeah, the Bible does not say that the entire globe was completely covered for 10 months or 1 year. It doesn't actually say how long it was completely covered. What it says was that the water came in and out, and it rose over a period of time, and it gives you when the ark was lifted up. So by that metric alone, you can tell it's less than a year. Actually,
okay. Well, let me enlighten you on the Bible then, because it said for 40 days it kept coming up. The waters rose and increased greatly on the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the water. They rose greatly on the earth. All the mountains and under the heavens were covered. The waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. Every living thing that moved on land, bird, wildlife, livestock, and all mankind. So it says that they're all covered. The waters flooded the earth for 150 days after that. Right.
Which verse are you reading from? Which verse are you reading from?
Well, Genesis 6:17, I believe it is.
6:17. He said, that's not it. He says, "Behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth." That's not it.
Hang on a sec. Then it is
chapter 7, verse 12. "And the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights. In the self same day, Noah entered the ark. And they went into the ark." And so you got to go a ways. 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered. Okay, and verse 17, chapter 7, verse 17 says, "And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up above the earth." Now, what it does not actually say there, I see where you might construe this to mean, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I've just said the way it reads, it is a little bit funny, but it says, "And the flood was 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, and it was lifted up." So if you took that literally, you would say the ark was lifted up after 40 days.
Well, let me just get to where I was going, because you kind of interrupted my train of thought. So in 8, but God remembered that about the water receded steadily from the earth. At the 150 days, the water had gone down. On the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So that sort of says that the 17th day of the 7th month, like it continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. So how do you explain that in the timeline?
That's what I was trying to tell you. My only real point that I was making is that the Earth was not underwater for an entire year. It was probably only under, and the Bible does not clarify this point, but it was probably only underwater for anywhere from a few weeks to a few months at the most, 100% inundated.
So how did the bees survive?
On vegetation.
What vegetation? It's underwater.
You've got to be kidding.
Well, there's bees, right? And they were around before the flood. Correct?
You do know that vegetation floats, right? So if water rushes in and scours the surface of the land, a whole bunch of vegetation floats.
So you're saying that flowers, which they need to get nectar out of, floated to the top and continued to produce nectar for months on end. Is that what you're saying?
No, Mark, that's what you said. I never said that.
Well, I want to know how they survived, like whether you think that plants can survive in water when they've, flowers produce nectar, bees harvest that nectar. They don't have any other source of, they don't go around eating the actual plant. They eat the nectar. So how did that happen?
How did that happen? So
how did that happen?
2 points. Number one, I've already described how vegetation will float in water, very large,
including flowers. Yeah.
You ever heard of a peat bog? Or you ever heard of a floating log, floating biome? You know what a floating biome is?
Notoriously don't have flowers on them.
So there are also, the other point I wanted to bring up is the you've got the land area itself with land plants, but there are also vegetation mats that live on water. So the pre-flood ocean may have had a significant amount of vegetation on the ocean surface as well. So as far as bees surviving, again, the entire globe is not inundated completely for an entire year. Bees would not have a problem surviving for a few weeks to a few months on what's left behind, nor would they have a problem surviving had they happened to be incidental passengers or even deliberate passengers, since they do produce honey on the ark. There are very common sense mechanisms. There were no
insects on the ark.
They're not requisite passengers. That's what I was
getting. So have you got any scientific evidence for these floating things and that bees can survive off, I don't know, water lilies or something? I don't know what you're claiming they survived off. Because if the top had been flooded, no flowers are surviving that. Especially not the amount. Because each flower only has a tiny bit of nectar in it, you need a field of flowers in order to, for bees to survive. That's what they need.
And you do know that bees and wasps and those types of insects go into dormancy during significant periods of the year, right?
What, underwater?
Why are you putting them underwater all of a sudden?
Well, how did their hives get above the water?
I thought we already talked about this.
Well, no, not really.
There are floating opportunities all over a 200 million square mile globe. Floating opportunities everywhere.
Do you have any scientific evidence to demonstrate that hives can in fact be sustained on floating, I don't know, barges or something? Is what you're talking about? Floating biomes, I think, is the word that you use.
I have described floating vegetation in a very generic sense. I have described floating biomes. I have described peat bogs. There's a variety of types of floating vegetation. Some are dead. There's a word that the scientific community would use for that, probably detritus or something like that. But anyway, some's dead, some's not. Not all plants that get lifted up off the earth have to just fall over dead and are completely useless to the insect world just because they're floating on top of the water.
So all of the insects survive, all the beetles, all of the flies, all of the praying mantises, everything survived on top of this floating mythical carpet you've got going on here.
To be clear, everything we have alive today at the created kind level, not the species level, yes.
What's a kind?
What's a kind?
Could you describe a kind for me, please?
Yeah, let's not be petty about this, and I'm not trying to be, derogatory to you or anything, but I'm only saying it this way because sometimes people get really argumentative over this very silly point. A kind is roughly equivalent to the family in the modern taxonomy system. So if you can just think about it that way, think about it at the family level.
Oh, okay. So there was only one species from each family in the ark?
I didn't say that.
Well, you said it was roughly equivalent to the family level, and there was kinds on the ark.
It is.
Right? There wasn't.
Was
there individual species on the ark?
What are we talking about? Are we talking about insects or animals? Are we talking about insects or animals?
Either. Well, insects are technically animals if you want to go with the standard sort of thing. But I'm talking about other animals that they say were on the ark.
So for land animals specifically that are requisite passengers, because they are only taken at the family level, roughly, then there is technically, in modern vernacular, only one species representative of each family. At the insect level that are not requisite passengers, that would not have to be true.
Right. So let's say it's just a family as Felidae, for instance. So you do acknowledge through that speciation has to happen, right? That if it's just one family from the family aboard there, speciation will have to happen. That's
what we get accused of. Hyperspeciation, I believe, is the word people like to use.
Sure, yeah. I find it hard to believe that would happen, in a few thousand years.
Why?
Well, because speciation usually takes a lot longer than that. The changes are very, very small.
How long does it take?
Well, I mean, it takes a while. I don't think we can sort of say for each one, but usually thousands upon thousands of years.
Thousands upon so tens to hundreds of thousands of years. Is that fair?
Probably, yeah.
Okay, so no, Mark, it doesn't. It does not take that long. In the real biological world, it does not take that long.
Okay, that's your story. Yeah, gotcha. So how do you explain all of the civilizations that sort of went through the flood without, the Japan, you mentioned it briefly, the Jotun period, where we have completely uninterrupted Japanese society, never recorded a flood. They were completely fine, did not have any lapse between their thing. Do you have any evidence that there was a flood in Japan during this Jotun period?
Do they have any fossils under their feet? And what do you mean by during? What do you mean by during?
What do you mean by fossils a result of the flood? Is that what you're saying?
Not all fossils, no. But part of the point here, Mark, is that when you make these claims like this, you're basically, in most cases, leaning on the secular timeline for those civilizations. One of them that you had said something like 14,000 BCE, I think is what it said. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean that's the early or intringent Jotun period, the very first one. That's split into multiple sort of. So there's a incipient initial early, middle, and late Jotun period in Japan, where it was sort of a Paleolithic era or Paleolithic adjacent era that went through that period without sort of any problems whatsoever.
No, and that's the whole point of that what I deem to be a very bad argument. You can only get those timelines from a very erroneous dating method.
So you're basically saying, nah, that civilization got wiped out and suddenly came back together? Is that
no, I didn't say that either, Mark. I never said anything like that.
What are you saying then?
I said the dating methods are bogus that are used to determine when those civilizations existed.
Oh. Do you have any scientific evidence of that, or is that just
Mark, but I don't think you have the patience for it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I get that you're sort of making this claim, but these are kind of the things that we pick up. Well, maybe we should go to another one that you can explain without going into too much. How did the Tower of Babylon get built? Sort of 100 years after the flood.
The Tower
of Babel. Yeah, you're correct. Yeah, Tower of Babel. How did that get built?
A group of people got together and built it.
Yeah, how many people?
I don't know, because the Bible doesn't actually tell us how many people.
Okay. It's the largest tower ever, right?
I don't know.
It was going to reach up to the heavens, correct?
It never got finished, so I'm not sure you can legitimately call it the largest tower ever.
Okay, but, you know, in order to build a tower, you would need a civilization, right?
You would need some people cooperating in a civilized fashion, yes.
Well, you'd need a civilization. So at that time, how many people were in the world after the flood killed everybody?
I thought we just discussed this. The Bible doesn't tell us how many people were in the world.
Well, it was 100 years after the flood.
Okay.
101 years after the flood.
So,
how many people were around?
Because we don't know, we have to make some estimates, right?
Well, sure. I mean, roughly how many people would it be required to build a tower in Babel?
So what would be your reasonable estimate for how many people could come from 6 people in 101 years?
Oh, I mean, if you're doubling every, say, 20 years or so, I think that would be more than reasonable.
Okay, so your estimate, it's going to be pretty low, but that would be something like 2 to the 5th power, right? Which would be what, 32?
Well, it starts out with 8. I'm not sure if that makes a difference.
So if you want to add the 8 to the 32, you'd have 40, right?
Sure.
Okay, there's not a whole lot of detail there to go on, so I don't know, but I do know that the hypothetical fastest reproduction rate can be much faster than that. Because it's a human decision to procreate or not. It really depends on the individuals and what they thought they were trying to accomplish, right? What the Bible does tell us is that it was the 2nd year after the flood before they began to have children. So with that, if they decided they needed a lot of people, they could have easily doubled at a rate of every 10 years without batting an eye.
With a lot of inbreeding.
So what that means is, we'll do a little bit of math real quick and say that should have been 1,024 people plus the original 8. So you could easily have 1,000 people, and yes, that's enough to build a tower. To be clear, to begin building the tower, because they got interrupted and dispersed well before they ever finished it.
Yeah, I don't think that's enough to build a tower, because.
Do you have any scientific evidence that that's not enough, Mark?
Well, just from the Bible, they actually split up and went to different regions. I don't know if you saw that in the previous passage. So I think that, your idea that they can produce sort of, that amount of people each is a bit ridiculous. And the idea that a entire civilization can be maintained off of 1,000, that 1,000 people isn't a civilization. That's not enough to build a tower. So, a group of 1,000 people is, surviving at that point. Like we're talking about before, you had cranes and things like that. It probably took like hundreds of thousands of people to build the pyramids. It's ridiculous to think that amount of people could do that. I mean, I just want the audience to think about that for a second. Like 1,000 people building the greatest tower that was supposed to reach the heavens. It's preposterous.
You keep saying that, and I keep reminding you that the tower was never finished, number one. Number two, I find it really interesting that you brought up cranes and Egypt in the same...
Was it going to be finished? Was it going to be finished?
At least that was the intent, but how long would that have taken, and how many more people could have been born and contributed to it during the time it took to finish? I don't know.
Okay, and so how do you explain the 138 years we have the first Mesopotamic Empire, which is sort of Sargon of Akkad's empire?
Where
estimated 1 point.
Where did the 138 years come from? It didn't come
well,
from
it's
the
just
Bible.
on the usual. Well, it's on the usual timeline for the Bible that is given. I mean, the usual date that I keep getting again and again is about 2345 to 2344. I mean, tell me if that's incorrect.
For what? Sorry, for the what?
For the flood.
The flood?
Yeah.
Well, all I'm pointing out is the 138-year timeline between the end of the flood and this other civilization you're referencing. Where did that 138-year timeline come from?
Well, it came from like sort of digging up artifacts and sorting through where people were. Like, this isn't sort of a guesswork thing that they're doing in historical accounts. They account for all of this. I don't know why.
That's kind of the point, though. You're trying to constrain.
Yeah.
You're trying to constrain this massive civilization to a 138-year timeline, but the timeline was derived from secular dating methods, which are known to be wildly unreliable.
So when did the Bible happen?
You've already given roughly 4,400 years ago for the end of the flood. We've already
so the
well
date that I've
established
given, 2345 to 2344 BC is correct as far as you're concerned.
Okay. Yeah. That
Well,
sounds
I'm asking.
roughly,
I'm not.
that does sound roughly correct. Yes.
Yeah. So scientifically, we can look at all of these different sort of civilizations, and I mean, even the Egyptians were going through that time. There was one of the dynasties went straight through that time and continued, and we can tell that by reading the Egyptian hieroglyphics and making. We've got an account. Like, if you look up, and I encourage people to do so, look up the account of Egyptian timeline from the start to the finish, because we've documented all of their dynasties. We've documented the Chinese dynasty that went through that time.
Let me ask you something real quick.
We've documented the Akkadian Empire that sort of was nearby and was sort of the first Mesopotamian empire, was anywhere from 800,000 to 1.5 million people living in it, which is just from 8 people in 138 years is just insane.
So let me ask you a question real quick.
Well, I just want to finish this. I just want to finish this. You've got 2 hypotheticals here. One is that a local flood happened and it was mythology, and sort of it was built up into this thing that wasn't really real. It was just a story. Or that every archaeologist is wrong, every single radiologist is wrong, everybody's wrong in the scientific community. TRock's right, and 8 people sort of multiplied into millions over the course of whatever, without any inbreeding whatsoever. It's not even a question of which is more probable, TRock.
Okay, now let me ask you a question.
Sure.
To be clear real quick, it's not a matter of whether I'm right. It's a matter of whether accurate history was recorded. And a whole lot of people well before my time have all come to the same conclusion I have. So it has nothing to do with whether I'm right and all the science world is wrong. Let me ask you this question, though. Do you believe everything the Egyptians wrote?
No, I think.
Then why do you believe their history? Then why do you believe their history?
Of gods. Yeah, if I could just finish the question without.
Well, you talked for a long time, and then I finally got a chance to answer.
Well, ask the question. Don't just get one thing, sort of, and not allow me to clarify what I mean by that. That's just rude.
Oh,
man. Come on.
Yeah, yeah.
So I don't believe all the stuff about the gods and that the pharaoh was a god and all of these things, which often, they speak to mythology, sure. But when we have hieroglyphics that point out the times, we then clarify that with the dating techniques we have for architecture, for pottery, for all the things that we put into practice for people spending their entire lives studying when these dynasties occurred and how they formed. And we also do other sort of radiometric, and all the dates line up from multiple lines of evidence. Yeah, I believe that, because that is a consistent scientific way to get something. When you're sort of saying, hey, here's something I drew in paint. Yeah, I don't believe that, because that's not scientific. Sorry.
Okay, you done?
And you haven't given any scientific evidence. You've just given claims. That's all you've done tonight.
If you don't feel like physics is science, then I think you're in the wrong business.
Yeah, I don't think the physics you're doing is science. I think that
I don't think you've done any physics.
No, I think that the physics that physicists are doing is science. I don't think the physics that you say, hey, it's this PSI for this material, so therefore tectonics, like sort of plate tectonics, wrong is science. I think that's just you misconstruing how the physics applies to that field because you've never worked in geology.
That's funny, Mark, because you literally accused me of not doing real physics. You pulled up what's equivalent to a Facebook meme for a mythological event that was supposed to happen. And one of your complaints had to do with physics is equations and so on and so forth. But your Facebook meme had 0 physics equations on it.
Oh, you'd like me to find physics equations?
I want you to show me how the tensile strength of the crust is significant to drag an entire continent across the mantle.
I've already.
If you're going to do physics,
that.
do that physics for us.
I've already explained that basically, but here we go. Okay, so I'll share my screen if Donny is there. I would love to share my screen. And this is from the University of California, which is a great facility. Okay, so this is geoscientists, the forces driving plate motions. Force, ridge minus push plus F slab minus pull equals F viscous, drag equals 0. That's a force balance. Subduction zones, all of the physics for it. This is stuff that we understand. This isn't like I'm just saying, hey, we've got this thing and I drew it in paint and here it is. This is stuff that we have actually calculated. There's the equations for viscous drag. Okay, all of the equations for you. You can go through it. And if you understand geology, you can do this. I have a friend who's a geologist, great guy. Shout out to Beamsy. He can calculate this because he works in that area. Here is the viscous drag on two sides of a plate. Here's the slab pull force. That's the one where the subduction zone goes down like a tablecloth over the edge and starts to pull it. That's the physics for that. TRock saying that we can't provide physics is hilarious.
Mark, show me where they put the tensile strength into the equations.
Subduction.
So one of the points that
it's very specific, and this is very, very complicated. I mean, this is right on the
yeah. Imagine that. So, Mark, I appreciate you showing us that, but essentially, what I was doing earlier was a very simplified version of the exact same thing you're doing there. The problem with what you've got there is it's twofold. Number one, you're going to have to build in the tensile strength is extremely important here, but let me put it on a level that everybody can understand pretty easily. You know how a foundation of a house is built, where you have a footer on the perimeter of the concrete slab?
Earth isn't a house, mate. The Earth isn't a house.
Okay, Mark, follow some science for a minute, not some kind of high debating.
Yeah, I don't know. You asked.
Follow the science. The science is that if that slab sits there unsupported, and we're not talking directly tensile strength like you're trying to pull it right now, but if a concrete slab sits there improperly supported, it will literally break itself in half.
How is it unsupported? It's on liquid, or not liquid, but sort of viscous fluid. How is it unsupported?
That's not the point. You're missing the
point.
No,
that is the point.
I'm talking about
if you're making an analogy with something
Mark,
unsupported.
If you can listen for 2 minutes. I'm talking about concrete and its behavior when it's unsupported, and it's relevant because you get the exact same thing with the low tensile strengths that I showed for basalts and granites. In concrete construction that everybody can easily identify with, what happens is if your slab is not supported properly, it will break under its own weight. Now, I understand that there's a mantle underneath the continental crust that keeps that from happening. The problem goes back to the convection currents going up and down, and like the cold slab deal, all that's going to do is break. That's going to break the basalt layers or the rock layers.
They're not going up and down across the continent. They're going up and down at the edges of the continental plate, and it does break. That's why it's like sea floor spreading occurs. So the up and down currents,
the continent.
The up and down currents are here. See how the currents are going up and down here?
That's very much like the diagram I made. That is very much like the diagram I made, Mark.
No, it's not, because you had the
I had the mountain out here and the continent over here, just like your diagram, your picture there has.
Yeah. I don't like yours was sort of really misinterpreted.
It was crude
because you were having.
It was very crude, but it was essentially this.
Like TRock, you were having the mountains causing the force that we're talking about.
No,
that pull force, the slab pull.
That is not what I did, Mark.
Well, you can rewind it, audience, and see if it's any good. But the whole idea is you're saying it's going up and down that would break the plate. Number one, this isn't a piece of concrete. This is so thick. Like, I mean, like the whole idea that you'd sort of compare it to a thin piece of concrete that's a house support with a continental plate is just it's weird. It's just weird, okay? And then the next thing is that up and down is only happening at the very edge where it's causing seafloor spreading. So I don't know why you would sort of go, oh, well, it would cause it to break. Yeah, it's broken. That's why the seafloor spreading and the volcanic ridges are actually being formed along there. It doesn't sound like you've got a good handle on what it is that you're actually talking about.
Are you done misrepresenting everything I said?
I didn't. I didn't misrepresent anything. So what did I misrepresent? What did I misrepresent?
Explained quite clearly that the standard paradigm is cold slab down, hot plumes up. I'm not trying to paint this picture sort of along the lines of what you said, where it's just moving up and down. That's not what I said. There is an upward force. There's a downward force. There are also vectors that determine which directions the forces are moving. It doesn't matter that those slabs, the crust that ranges from something like 10 miles, or maybe as low as 10 miles, but generally I think they say 30 to 60 miles thick. Again, cross-sectional area, the direction of the force vectors, the very low tensile strength of virtually all rocks, and all you get out of that is breakage. You cannot drag a continent like that.
Well, all the geologists completely disagree with you, and you asked me to show you the physics of the tectonic movement as we understand it. Said that I couldn't do it. I obviously can. I just did. So you're wrong on that as well.
You showed some of the
theory. So I don't know why I would get into I don't. Just because I didn't show an MS Paint, with a crude diagram and sort of what you think may be a problem because of some reason you're comparing the continental shelf to a slab of a house and the slab of a house breaks. So you're applying that to a kilometers thick crust is, it's baffling. But, nobody has to account for that because it's not a problem. That's the thing. Like it is
a problem, Mark, and that's why I brought that up about these Encyclopedia Britannica articles saying that there are multiple theories. They can't seem to. It's poorly understood. They can't seem to come to agreement.
No, it didn't say that.
Some say push. Some say
misrepresenting
pull.
that.
And there is
got a little bit of crosstalk there. Okay. Right now, T-Rock says we have 2 minutes left. T-Rock, finish your thoughts, your arguments uninterrupted. Then Mark will throw it back to you. You give a response uninterrupted, and we'll do that back and forth just a couple times for the last 2 to 3 minutes, and then we'll move into closing. So T-Rock, go ahead, and then we'll throw it back to Mark.
So one more time on the article that I was citing, it is poorly understood. Some say push, some say pull. There is yet another one that is in that article, if you go read it, that talks about what they describe more or less, I can't remember the exact word, but they describe more or less as a global current, like as if there are banded layers sort of in the mantle that create a more global scale current that has more of a unified direction. That's one of the other hypotheses that has been put out there. It is very poorly understood. You can pretend like we understand plate tectonics. Yeah, we understand the plates are moving, but it's the driving force that is poorly understood. So people keep trying to work out the ideas and the physics to see how it could be. And the reason they are is exactly what I've been describing all along, because the tensile strength of the material that you're trying to push and pull with is not significant, is not sufficient enough to actually move a continent.
Okay, Mark, back to you.
Yeah, so when it says it pushes and pulls, it's just talking about where the pressure is being applied on the plate, usually all across of it. But if you're looking from a perspective of one end, it's pushed. If you're looking from perspective of another end, it's pulled, and it's like slab pulled. I've already explained that T-Rock got completely and utterly wrong. So this thing about it's poorly understood, his own article, and I can bring it up if you want. It basically says that what powers the convection currents is poorly understood. It doesn't say what he says, like he's quote mined it to say, hey, this means all of it's poorly understood. No, it says that convection currents are poorly understood, but you want to skip over that, because I understand that you don't want to actually provide a genuine sort of representation of the actual science that we have. And don't forget, he was supposed to be providing you all with a scientific explanation of how the flood did this. which he hasn't done. All he's done is attack the mainstream science, attack the mainstream science. He's not actually providing any scientific evidence for his own worldview. All he's doing is attacking the science that's already there. Even if the convection currents are caused by something other than what we think they are, doesn't get you any closer to a flood. That's the thing. Like, you've got to show the flood, and TRock has failed to produce anything scientific. And I'm really sorry, but an MS Paint draw up of what you think it is, and then sort of, a few conclusions made based on your misunderstanding of how thick the continental crust and the seafloor crust is not scientific evidence. I'm sorry, it just isn't.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, TRock, now back to you.
Okay, I need to share my screen again, Don.
You're shared.
Okay,
yeah, you're good.
See this map? This is the Pacific Ocean, very large. You see all these bizarre geological features slicing and dicing in a random bunch of directions here. What that tells anybody who's actually using the equations that Mark tried to show and pretend he was making an accurate physics and actual physics refutation of what I'm saying, what people who actually do physics knows is that this type of physical arrangement of the seafloor basically tells you that the force vectors are so erratic they can't be unified in any coherent way that's going to produce a result that would drag the continent. They're bizarrely all over the place. And without that is why that other final theory that I brought up even exists. It's because if you do the localized thing where you've got mountain building like this, and then you've got trench creation from cold slab subduction, if you try and use that as the mechanism, all it does is breaks apart and doesn't provide adequate force. So for that reason, somebody out there came up with this idea of what I call more unified sort of, think of it like stratified global currents that are all moving unanimously in the same direction, but that has no support, no scientific support either. It's just a hypothesis thrown out there because they have not actually solved the physics for any of this. And when they attempt to do it, all this bizarre vectoring that you would actually get out of it, all it's going to do is tear everything apart. What's actually moving the continent was, in my estimation, gravitational collapse, where it was above sea level, like similar to the way it is today. There were aquifers underneath it that when the fountains of the deep broke up, water came out, pressure drop, and then the continent collapsed with it to drag it underwater and cause rapid enough global scale currents to deposit sediments on top of the continents.
Okay, thank you, TRock. Mark, back to you.
Yeah, I don't know this whole thing about the Pacific. I'd like to see the physicist that he's talked to that says that we can't explain it. And maybe we can't. Maybe that physics hasn't got all of the information it needs to do precise calculations on it. Physics isn't the only science out there. Sort of geologists are doing science. Like that is science. So the whole idea that you have to explain everything with physics, like we can't really apply physics to things like black holes, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. This is the thing, like he's just doing an argument from ignorance that, hey, if you can't explain it, it can't be possible. No, you've got to show that these aquifers actually broke open. Where is your evidence that there was aquifers that broke open outside your book? There is no evidence for this. You just claim it. Where is the physics for these aquifers, TRock? Give me the physics for that if you're so big on physics. The only reason physics got brought up is because you said I couldn't show the physics for these plate movements, and I could. And now you're embarrassed because, I clearly can show it. So where's the physics on your aquifers, TRock? Show us that.
So you did not show physics that actually demonstrates how the standard theory really did do what they claim it did. That's not what you showed. That's real nice of you to pretend that's what you showed. That's not what you showed, Mark. aquifers, underground or submarine aquifers. They're all over the world. They were discovered in modern era in the early 1900s, I believe. There are literally springs of water coming out from the ocean floor. They also come up from the continents. That's why we are able to drill and get well water on the continents. They're everywhere. You don't need physics. You need to go and look for the features. The purpose for the physics is that geochemistry didn't put the Cambrian strata 5, 6, 7, 8,000 feet above sea level. The fossils in the strata didn't put them there. Geology didn't put them there. Some physical geophysics activity put them there. That's the purpose for using physics to explain the rock formations that we see today so high above sea level. It's not a biology question. It's not a geology question. It's go look at the physical nature and determine what type of physics actually moves it from point A to point B.
Well, this is interesting. I mean, it basically is like I can show the physics that geologists are doing to sort of, basically investigate what we should see and make testable predictions, and then come up with, those predictions being proved right from use of things like underground radar and earthquake analysis and things like that. TRock says that I have to provide all the physics, and I do so. When I challenge him for the same for his aquifer thing, he basically says he doesn't have to show physics, he just have to look at it, which is just hilarious because, the idea that you just look at it and that makes it right is just, it's ridiculous. Why is it that I have to show physics for the model and I do so, and then you basically dodge and say you don't have to show physics for yours? Where is the physics for yours? You didn't answer that. You didn't address it. You just said, oh, well, I don't need physics for mine. Stop special pleading. If you demand physics for mine, why aren't you showing physics for yours, TRock? Where are the equations? I want to see them right now. Go.
So you just did a brilliant equivocation fallacy. What I said about the aquifers in physics is you don't need a physics equation to know whether they exist or not. That is a very different thing. That is a very different thing than having to use physics to demonstrate whether a particular physical model actually works. There's a difference between the existence of something and whether a physical model works. One requires physics, the other requires eyewitness observation.
I'm not asking for observations or physics or anything. I know aquifers exist. I'm asking, which you're dodging completely, I'm asking for the physics of them causing the things that you say they caused. The physics of the flood, your calculations, because I'm giving calculations for how plate tectonics is working. Why aren't you giving calculations for how you're saying that these continents are shifting around? You're just dodging to, oh, well, these aquifers exist. Yeah, but you've claimed they cause the continents to move. So where is the physics for that? Where is the physics for your flood? Where are the physics showing that your methodology is actually better than the one I gave you the equations for? Where is that, TRock?
So you ever heard of E equals 1/2 mv squared?
Energy equals one mass times velocity.
Yeah, great.
You've got a velocity equation.
If you don't recognize that, you have no idea what those physics equations that you try to pull up mean.
Well, just give us the flood ones then. Give us the flood ones.
The basic physics.
Stop dodging.
So I put two physics equations together to demonstrate mountain formation and how we get those. It is E equals 1/2 mv squared, and it's the other one is P equals M times H times G.
So I know. Calculate the energy.
Huh? Say that again.
Calculate the energy. How'd you calculate the energy?
Those are the two energy equations. One of them is kinetic. The other one is potential, right?
Yes. So how did you calculate the energy?
So all you have to do is put the two equations together, insert a ratio of the mountain potential energy with the mass of the continent that it sets on, because that's where the kinetic energy comes from the continent. The potential energy comes from the mountain. So when you put those two equations together and solve them simultaneously, what you find out is the continents have to have moved somewhere on the order of 1 to 2 meters per second in order to build mountains as high as we see today. The slow and gradual physics that is touted so often in the literature, which incidentally can never be demonstrated because it requires too much time and people don't live long enough to demonstrate that, that physics doesn't work because erosion rates are extremely fast for very slow and gradual rise of seafloors, mountains, doesn't matter what it is. Whenever you talk about plate tectonic movement, isostatic compensation, and all that good stuff that people like to talk about, the erosion rates are so fast that a very slow and gradual movement of anything on the continent is obliterated in less than 10 million years by erosion. So it requires the physics of a fast-moving system, which is what I described to you, kinetic energy and potential energy.
Yeah, well, the potential in the mountain, as far as I'm aware, is just basically it's downward acceleration under gravity. Like, that's essentially it. And of course, that affects the size of it and everything. But where is the water? Where is the force of the water coming in? How did you distribute that force? Where is the force on each part of the thing? As the equation showed on mine, it showed how the seafloor spreading worked. It showed how the slab pull worked. Where is your equations for all of this? How does it explain all of this?
To be clear, seafloor spreading is more of an idea of mantle material coming up to create new seafloor. That's what seafloor spreading is, right? Yes. That's not a driving force to move a continent.
Correct.
It's hot molten material that has no tensile or compression strength, either one.
Correct.
Okay. So why you keep talking about I showed equations that explain seafloor spreading has nothing to do with the movement of the continents.
Yeah, because all you're basically referring to is equations for converting energy into force. That's it.
Yes.
You're sort of not showing any equation of how you get that from the flood.
Yes, I did. You don't need it. What you need to understand when you build these
show
equations,
it to us. Send it to them. Can we check them? Can we send them to a physicist?
That's like asking, did somebody measure the kinetic energy during the great earthquake that happened in Turkey several years ago? Did people actually measure in real time the kinetic energy of that? No, they did not. It just happened.
Don't you know what a size? Don't ask a question, then move onwards. We do measure through seismometers the energy that earthquakes do generate. Yes. What are you talking
measure
about?
Some of the energy. You don't measure all of it.
Well, we get a pretty accurate idea of the amount of energy that's involved by using equations that sort of measure how far away that seismometers are. Because there's multiple ones of them. It's not just one on the planet kind of thing. There's multiple of them, and how much energy is
great. And how quick did it happen? How quick did that whole event happen?
Quick?
I was referring to that big earthquake in Turkey several years ago. How quick did that happen? Right. The energy caused it to happen very quickly. It didn't take millions of years to do a very devastating amount of damage in Turkey.
Right.
Yeah, that's the point of using kinetic energy and potential energy in these equations, because it much more accurately describes geophysical movement
than a seismometer.
Yeah.
You think that you estimating how much potential energy is within something and how much sort of kinetic energy comes out. You think that's more accurate than a seismometer and the readings that people get from all over the world about an earthquake?
No, Mark, that's not what I said. What I'm saying is, if I use my same equations for potential and kinetic energy in the case of the Turkey event, I could come up with very similar numbers to what the seismometers measured in real time. Of course you don't. You think it always has to take millions of years unless we see it in real time.
Well, no, I don't think the earthquake took millions of years. I think that it built up pressure maybe over a long period of time, but I don't think, the event itself happened over millions of years. That earthquake didn't happen over millions of years. It ended. I don't understand what you're trying to say.
That was the point I made. I know you don't think
I
know you don't think that event took millions of years. What I'm saying is, when you didn't see the event and it's not in recorded history, you just automatically ascribe it to millions of years.
What, an earthquake?
No.
I don't get what you're saying.
The leftover results
events
of a catastrophe.
You know, some events are very quick. You know, like we know that the eruption in Pompeii, for instance, was very quick. People didn't even get time to run, kind of thing. That's why we've got such an amazing record of people set in stone. Essentially, it's incredible. I've seen it myself. It came to my city, and I saw it. It was insanely quick, and then probably ended very fast as well. You know, I don't know exactly how long, but you know, the idea for that to have happened over millions of years is ridiculous. No, some geological events are very short. Some geological events are very long. And this is sort of, so I don't claim everything happens over millions of years. No.
I didn't say you did.
Okay.
Is there any minute in this conversation when you can accurately describe what I said?
Well, I'm just saying what I thought that
so
you said.
Pompeii, you brought up Pompeii.
That you said, I mean, we can rewind it and see. I'll watch it again, and you know, and I apologize I've misrepresented you. But I thought you said you think everything happened over millions of years.
That's not what I said. That's not at all.
Okay, I'll rewind it and find out then, TRock, because it certainly.
What I'm saying is, just like Pompeii, just like Turkey, when we see it happens very quickly. But if you take an event that you did not see happen and did not get recorded in history, like the Deep Spring Valley in California, that is not in recorded history. Yeah. Nobody saw it happen. All of a sudden, you switch gears. We can easily identify earthquake in Japan, Pompeii, Turkey. It always happens really fast. There's a volcano that sprang up in Mexico really fast in recorded history. And so when I use these physics equations, I'm doing what we see in real time. But the stuff that you showed that was really just kind of a hullabaloo explanation to attempt to explain something that happened in the distant past that we don't have recorded, all of a sudden we got to default to a completely different style of explanation other than very basic kinetic energy equations that very accurately describe what we do see as far as catastrophes in the modern world.
Well, yeah, I mean, some things take a long time. Like mountains don't just spring up overnight, TRock. I don't know what you expect to sort of see when it comes to these old things. What you're essentially saying at the moment is because the only thing we record is on a short geological timescale, everything must be on a short geological timescale. And that's just not true. There's events that take a lot longer than others. And I'm really sorry that you disagree with that. But that is the case. So the whole idea that the Himalayas or something was sort of sprang up all of a sudden, you know, I don't know how fast you think these continents are zipping around and why they're going so slow now.
I can explain, but I got to ask you though. So in my example that I keep bringing up, Deep Spring Valley, California, you got a stack of equations there that you tried to say actually explain something. How do you actually prove that something that happened over deep geological time is what those equations are describing? How do you prove that? You write the equation and you say it does, but how can you ever demonstrate that really was the correct method to demonstrate?
Yeah, because we can go around the earth and find the geological layers that match the geological layers in those areas. We can sort of match them up, not only with the types of rock that are there and the types of rock that have been, you know, sort of either sedimentary or igneous rock that is there. We can also match up like things like the fossil record and the fossil column, and it matches up perfectly. Everything matches up perfectly. And I'm sorry that you don't believe that, but that's how geologists go around. They can also use a number of different techniques to match up.
What I'm pointing out is you can never demonstrate deep time. You can never demonstrate deep time or that an event actually happened across deep time, because how do you show me a million years? Show me a million years, Mark.
So a million years, you can just go and look at the rock layers, and they will.
Oh, and that's a million years. A rock layer is not a million years, Mark.
Well, I mean, some are. You can see some that are sort of millions of years, especially on old continents like Australia. There's a lot of layers.
You can't show people a million years. You can look at a rock and say it took a million years, but you can't actually show a million years. I want to address something you asked. You asked
well, I just want to respond to that for a second before you move on to something else quickly. So the only way you can show a million years, if I can literally show you a million years like in the palm of my hand, which is sort of a ridiculous statement, I can only show you the evidence that a million years has passed. I don't know what you mean then by show me a million years. If sort of we can point to certain sort of geological things that are a million years old, and I can point to, you know, all kinds of stuff that are a million years old. I can point to the moon and things that are a million years old. But how do you show a million years?
In context, I well understand that a million years is not a physical object you can hold. It's an idea.
Yeah,
that is all it is. It's an idea. The point is, can you demonstrate? Can you actually demonstrate that 1 million years has this result? You cannot do that. All you can do is look and say it did, write an equation and make your equation say it did, but you can't actually demonstrate it.
Yes, I can. So the Green River Formation is the Green River Formation is one of my favorite things. It has varves. Do you know what a varve is?
Sure. They're typically in
so it's
double layers. Sets.
Yeah, it's a group of lakes that sort of have very fine layers, a dark layer during the growing season and a light inorganic layer during a dry season when it's all dried up, kind of thing. So each pair of layers of the seasons of, you know, sort of summer for the drying and winter of the dark seasons is represented by one varve, is a pair of layers representing a year. The mean thickness of the layers is about 18 millimeters, or 0.18 millimeters. These varves, we can see them form today. That's the thing. We can see them form today when they do form. And there's like 6 million years of there's 6 million layers of varves in the Green River Formation. So that is showing you 6 million years of varve formation over the summer and winter of drying and moisture.
Yeah, no, that's not showing 6 million years. That's saying that the layers calculate to 6 million years. In reality, those varves, if it really were a very slow and gradual process of simple deposition in a very still environment, nonetheless, have you seen how parallel some of those are? That means the water was pretty much sitting perfectly still for 6 million years. No, the physical characteristics of the varves are such that it is pretty much impossible that it took that long.
Do you have any scientific evidence of that?
For example, go look at them. You want scientific evidence? Go look at them. There should be
looking at things isn't scientific. TRock.
Really?
Like, you just can't look at something. Yeah, I had this issue with one of your debates where you looked at a sweet gum leaf and said, well, that's a maple leaf to me. It's not a maple leaf. It's a sweet gum leaf. Like, you got the leaf completely wrong, and it's not even in the
class
same
of tree that is very closely related, Mark.
It's not in the same class. It's not closely related. That's the thing. It just looks like a maple leaf. You don't just look at things and say, well, that's what it is. Right. And we can tell these varves are laid down annually. These pairs are laid down annually because they're still laid down annually.
No,
that's Mark, how they're formed. We can see them form like that. So where is your evidence? Where is your evidence that they're forming in some other way when we literally see them form on an annual basis from the thawing and the drying over a year?
There are a couple modern examples. There is the mini Grand Canyon. There is Mount St. Helens. There is a dam that broke Tom Sauk Mountain region, I believe. A dam broke in Missouri, not too awful far from where I live. Things that look almost identical to those varves that you're describing, if not perfectly identical.
No, they don't.
Those types of banded layers form in flowing water. They can also form from a horizontal deposition, but the ones that we see actually form today build thousands upon thousands of those varves in a matter of minutes, literally minutes. Look just like them.
No, they don't. The place in Missouri you're talking where the ice wall dam broke, they do not have the same geological features as we find in the varves in Utah, because they are formed from the winter and summer seasons, and you know that is how they form. I don't know any other way to tell you. And you're sort of claiming that the same things. Hang on, you're claiming that the same things form excuse me, same things form from flowing water, but they don't. That's the thing. Like, you're just saying they look like the thing I want it to be. No, it doesn't matter what it looks like to you, T-Rock. You looked at a maple leaf and it was a sweet gum leaf. It doesn't matter what it looks like. What matters is what it is. And they find out this is what the thing is. And you can't just look at something and assume it follows your worldview because it's convenient. I'm really sorry, mate, but that's not how science works.
So,
gentlemen, let me just jump in here real quick. It's been a great discussion. Time has flown by. It's been very free flowing, and it's been an entertaining debate with a lot of technical topics discussed. We are in bonus minutes, so we are in probably about 25 minutes worth of bonus. Oh, no. I could listen to you guys go at it all day. I'm just thinking we do have audience questions, and so we should probably wrap it up somewhere. And since T-Rock, you started the discussion, if I remember correctly, and so let's give Mark Reid the last word, but you do have a closing statement. And therefore, if there's anything you'd like to respond to, or there's some final points you'd like to address, basically just a way to wrap up our final thoughts and points, we can do so now. And so T-Rock will give you 5 minutes, and then Mark Reid, you get 5 minutes, and then we're going to jump into some audience questions. So T-Rock, whenever you're ready, go ahead.
So real briefly, I'm just going to respond to something Mark finished up with, and that is banded layers of alternating light and dark. There are people doing real world flume experiments that do this exact same thing. All you got to do is go watch them. Light and dark, light and dark, light and dark. They look just like varves. It is very simple physics to explain how you get banded layers like that in light and dark. So with that closing statement, so basically Mark much preferred to talk about animals and the ark and the boat and the timing and all that stuff. He didn't really come into this wanting to talk about the physics. He wants to default to a whole bunch of things besides real world physics. He pulled up a page to show us a bunch of physics equations. He keeps minimalizing the fact, the actual fact that geophysicists across the globe have a broad number of ideas in trying to explain plate tectonics, the driving forces, not whether or not they're moving, but the actual forces driving them, because none of them seem to make sense at some level. So some other guy comes along and says, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. Let's try this instead. And then another guy comes along and says, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right either. Let's try this instead. So there's a lot of disagreement out there. It's not a unified theory. There's still a lot of work to be done. If you had finished reading the article there, one of the problems with trying to work out any of it in the article's estimation is that some of the measurements that are needed are very difficult to get. It's not like you can just go around and take every metric that you think you need and then poof, you can create a solution for it. The actual measurements are difficult to do in many cases for the obvious challenges of going into the deepest parts of the ocean and taking more direct measurements in the mantle and that sort of thing. So no, Mark, I really do appreciate the fact you brought up some physics equations there, but if we had time to actually sit there and break them down, we would still find out that they're clueless how you drag or push continents around using the standard theory of driving forces. So anyway, maybe one of these days we can kind of slow it down and kind of focus a little more on a single topic instead of trying to push, drop some bizarre idea and run off to a different topic every time. So I really want to take a minute to thank everybody for the audience for tuning in and listening. I hope for the creationist's sake, at least, that you can kind of see we're trying to put together common sense ideas on whether the physics really does work or not. And the things I was showing from the tensile strength, if you do a little background research in engineering, you find out why we make our chains out of things like steel and cables out of steel and stuff like that, and not things like basalt and granite, because they just don't have the strength to push and pull things that way. So anyway, thank you, Donny, for putting this together. Thank you, Mark, for joining the conversation. And of course, thanks to the Lord for giving us his recorded words so that we can understand exactly what happened, so that we could even begin to try and put the physics together.
All right, TRock, thank you very much for that 5-minute concluding statement. We're now going to hand it over to Mark Reid. Mark, whenever you're ready, you also have 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so what's interesting about this debate is that it's on sort of scientific evidence for the flood. And I sort of went to sort of, you know, the real questions that I have, because I have these questions. How did scientifically these animals move back and forth? How did scientifically this work? But, you know, basically TRock wasn't interested in giving scientific evidence for the flood. He was at a different debate. He was at the debate that scientific evidence against mainstream geology. So what scientific evidence did he actually give for the flood? None. Nothing. He thinks he can poke holes in like one theory and say, hey, this makes my theory scientific. That is not how science works. He can disprove every single bit of mainstream geology. I mean, he hasn't, but he could, and that wouldn't get him one step closer to the flood. He demanded equations from me, wouldn't give them himself. All he gave was a basic energy to force equation that could apply to anything whatsoever. He didn't give how it applies to his fountains or his oceans or his flood at all. So what did he give? What scientific evidence did he give for the flood? Nothing. He drew a diagram and then claimed that disproved geology, which it doesn't. He didn't understand like how valves are created, you know, that they don't get created in the way that he's saying, and that no geologist is saying that valves are being created some other way. I would like to see their research on it, but he won't show that. He will only just claim that, hey, it's all being debunked, and think that that proves the flood. It doesn't. He basically says that, hey, you know, these civilizations, we don't know when they started, when they ended. Of course we do. Of course we do. The Egyptian civilization, look it up yourself. We've got a lot of evidence as to why the dynasties that they fell into as they went along. It's not something we're unaware of. And the whole idea is, yeah, we're uncertain of what causes the convection current, as TRock's Dingo said, but the convection currents themselves, we're not that clueless. We're not clueless at all about them. Like this whole idea that we're absolutely clueless about everything that happens in the earth is just ridiculous. Talk to an actual geologist sometime. Like they will actually tell you about why these things work. And the whole idea to compare a continental crust or the crust anywhere to a chain or a pole or something small made out of rock, that isn't really an accurate representation. And you already admitted that the PSI for these convection currents over a large enough area would be very small. So what's the problem? I don't know. It's really, really strange. You know, that he says that, oh, this couldn't possibly happen, but can't explain why. Can't give us equations as to how it would break these things. Just that it would. That's not scientific. Looking at things, just saying, oh, well, I looked at this and it looks like this, is scientific. No, it isn't. As I said, he got a maple leaf and a sweet gum leaf mixed up, and they weren't even in the same family. He just said, oh, it looks like this. No, nobody cares what it looks like to you. You've got to prove it scientifically. And just going and looking at stuff and making some kind of assumption about it is not scientific. And which is why the Bible is not a scientific book. It just isn't. But yeah, I'll wrap up there. Thanks you so much, Donny and TRock, for being here. And thank you for the audience for staying. I would have liked to see more scientific evidence for the flood rather against any other option. But sure, your time to waste, I guess.
Mark, thank you very much for that 5-minute concluding statement. Gentlemen, I appreciate your time. And as always, this was a comprehensive debate on a big topic. And so I think it's necessary to have lots of discussion time to engage each point and issue. So great job to the both of you, and also great job to our audience. Lots of excellent questions to keep us busy for roughly the next 25 minutes. And so let's just get into the questions, and we'll start right from the beginning with the first questions that have come in for the Genesis flood debate. Okay, so first question comes in from Sea Science Film Labs, and as usual, Mark and TRock are more than aware in our Q&As. Whoever the question's for, we'll make sure they get the last word. So Sea Science, question for both. At Isle of Wight and the White Cliffs of Dover that Vera Lynn sings about, these chalk deposits are composed of marine life. What event could have stacked these? Mark just ended with his conclusion, so why don't we start with you, TRock, if that sounds fair. Oh, TRock, I think you might be on mute.
So, okay. The standard paradigm would like for you to think that that happened strictly underwater and plate tectonics lifted it up onto the continents. That cannot be the case. The chalk is a little bit too thick and pure, actually. What did put it there? So personally, what I think happened is that there was probably a large swath of ocean floor where there were some diatom blooms and that sort of thing that actually build chalk layers. Basically during the flood, when the continents did start sliding rather rapidly, essentially all it did was kind of like a what I described once before as a hydrofoil or a hydroplane motion, where the continent comes in like that and basically scoops up very large swaths of diatom blooms and stacks them up on top of the continent. Very well explains why they're so thick and so pure. The alternate explanation of having them sit there and develop over extremely long periods of time obviously does not work, because bottom of the ocean floor gets covered in mud and gets very mucky and messy very quickly and easily. So there is no real good way to form that pure chalk over deep time. The ocean just simply moves too much for that to happen.
Okay, thank you, TRock. Mark, floor is yours.
Yeah, so these are coccoliths. They're basically creatures that lived during the Cretaceous era that died. So essentially it's made up of just shells of creatures that then are put under pressure and are lithified by the pressures that they're subjected to. Then sort of the continents shifted. The lithified remains of these carboniferous creatures were lifted up and form the White Cliffs of Dover that we see. But it's all due to the shell. It's basically essentially made of organisms' shells, that have been compressed into what they are now.
Okay, thank you, Mark and TRock, for your responses on that question. Okay, next question comes in from Taylor K. Thank you for your question. Question for Mark. If there is no flood, why are there fossils of marine life on high mountaintops all around the world?
Yeah, and that's a fascinating question. It's because those mountaintops used to be underwater, so they're marine ones. But what we find, which is really, really interesting, is that they are more basal. They're more primitive. They're sort of very, very basic life forms that you find up there, and you don't find up there sort of the more advanced life forms in fossils. The tectonic plate movement accounts for all of that. We actually don't find them on the very tops of mountains, which is interesting. It's only a certain way up, because not enough time has passed for them to be pushed all the way up, and there's still some there that wasn't underwater. So a better question is, why do we find them going up the mountain and then they stop? There's a question for you.
Thank you, Mark. TRock, floor is yours. Oh, I think you might be on mute, TRock, if you want to just unmute yourself.
Sorry, I'm muting myself so I don't interrupt. But okay, yeah, the one piece that Mark did get right is they did used to be underwater. That's part of a global flood. The uplift, that was the whole center of the debate. One of the points that I really wanted to bring out is that in deep time ideology, they cannot get enough resolution to nail things down to within even a couple thousand years when you get very far back into the distant past, and certainly not on the order of 1 year, months, or weeks as described in the Bible. They can't get that kind of resolution. So when those were underwater, pretty much everything else was too at the same time. That's the whole point of pointing to high elevation Cambrian strata. Yes, they are lower life forms. Nothing unusual about that. The motion of getting those mountains up that high, you have to have a rapid collision to do that sort of thing. Very much related to the chalk discussion that we just had. if you try and raise that chalk up out of the ocean through very slow and gradual plate tectonics, shoreline erosion will obliterate them before they get very high. They'll never get high. Shoreline erosion will just completely destroy them, and they'll never really get above sea level anyway. Mountains actually have the exact same problem. They're in more of a vertical position, though. You get all the weathering and stuff that normally happens, but because the vertical orientation is such that it is, it's much like the free body diagram I was describing earlier. Your force vectors go primarily down, which means gravity takes over whenever you have freeze-thaw cycles that tend to bust rocks apart. If you've never seen that happen, you can bench test that. That's real physics. Those mountains would have eroded away long before they ever got that steep or that high, had it been a slow process. So fossils up there basically mean that that mountain was in a position where there was fossil bearing strata. As it pushed up, it just carried them with them. Didn't happen to be in Mark's example. I don't know that I would buy into that 100%, but I'll take his word. At least in some examples, it's probably true. You push if there do happen to be any other types of fossils on top. It doesn't matter whether they're higher order, or doesn't matter what they are. There is still erosional processes happening during the uplift anyway. So if you strip a bunch of that off, that's not any real mystery to understand.
Thank you, TRock. Mark, you get the last word. Go ahead.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not sure what you were saying that they should split apart. I think you were talking about the cliffs of Dover on that one, I think. But no, okay. Well, I don't know why fossils that are buried underground that are subjected to warping and things like that should have these forces acting upon them. It's not like they're just out in the open or anything. We have to actually dig to find them. But it's so weird. I'm not sure where you get the thing that things should just split apart. It just sounds like your idea that the tectonic plates should just split apart for some weird reason. You also didn't answer why there's no fossils on the top, because erosion processes should be happening all over the mountain, not just one point. So he hasn't answered that at all. He's just sort of said, hey, erosion specifically happened on the very top, but nowhere down the sides. That doesn't sound very scientific to me. For some reason, erosion is happening at very specific points to sort of make it seem like the entire thing wasn't underwater, rather than the entire thing being underwater, which is, if we got fossils everywhere on the mountain, is what we'd expect to see. Very convenient erosion, apparently. But thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mark Reid, for the final word. Okay, so next question for you, TRock from BeamZ. Thank you for the question, BeamZ. Question for TRock. How would you explain the energy dissipation with your numbers, as current force is, and he's got the numbers there, yours would be, there's some more numbers, and degrees Celsius from friction. Guess we're, I'm assuming, a heat problem related question. But anyways, go ahead. Well, I think you're on mute, TRock.
I'm good at that. I keep muting myself so I don't interrupt Mark. But okay. As far as I'm concerned, those are completely made up numbers. I have no idea where you got them from. But I will talk just briefly about energy dissipation, since that's your phrase that you used, and an alleged heat problem that does seem to be implied per what Donny said. Energy dissipation. So energy dissipation is, well, when we're talking about mechanical energy, we're talking about an energy that's related to the inverse of the cube of the distance from the source, which means if you're this far away and you've got, 10 joules of energy or whatever, as you move away, the amount of energy remaining at that distance is related to the inverse of the cube of that distance, similar to the inverse square law that you hear talked about sometimes when it comes to tidal forces and stuff like that. Energy dissipation is related to the inverse of the cube instead of the square. As far as temperature goes, okay, you have to be much more specific when you talk about heat problems. Mark brought it up, and I absolutely would love to have that discussion about heat problems with somebody sometime. there's a couple sources for heat problems that are alleged in the creation model, as I understand it. One of them has to do with accelerated radiometric decay, which I think is the one Mark was alluding to. He can clarify that. The other one has to do with friction on the continents moving too rapidly, per my model that I was trying to demonstrate. So I will very briefly say the one about accelerated radiometric decay, that actually, interestingly, so yes, I will grant that there are a number of creationists that that hold to the idea of accelerated radiometric decay. I personally do not. I take a very strong position against that idea. But the more interesting part is they actually derive that because that comes from CPT, catastrophic plate tectonics, and they cite that as the driving motion for rapid, what they call runaway subduction. For me, I don't subscribe to the runaway subduction idea that they hold either. So neither one are relevant to my model. There is no accelerated radiometric decay, and there is no subduction as the driving force for the continental movement. So hopefully that answers your question about temperature, basically. I won't take a whole lot of time here to tell you what I do think is the actual cause, because it's just a long conversation, but I guess I'll just leave it for there and let Mark give his opinion.
All right, Mark, over to you.
Yeah, so what he's talking about is a claim made by TRock that the friction would be enough to shatter the plate. So if that amount of friction was being applied, there would be an enormous amount of energy built up if that was the case. So what he's asking you is, if the friction is as high as you claim, how do you explain where that energy is dissipating to? Because we would have no explanation as to how that energy would dissipate on the standard model. So I think that because you've made the claim that the friction is incredibly high, that you should have at least an idea of the mechanisms at which that energy is dissipating.
Okay, Mark, thank you for that clarification. That does, if that is truly what he intended, that is a different question.
I hope so. Sorry if I got it wrong, Beansy.
Yeah, no, you're probably right. Nevertheless, there is a major assumptive fallacy in that. In that, what you're assuming in your estimation of what should have happened in my model is that original continent is here, and the friction is the same in its original position as it is today and stayed constant the entire time. That's the only way you could possibly come to that kind of bizarre conclusion. I understand why you did that. I'm not trying to beat anybody up over that, but it's a very wrong assumption about my model in particular. I kind of alluded to this earlier. In my model, the continents are setting up above aquifers, water-bearing aquifers, and it is gravitational collapse. So the friction, while it's in that position, is very, very different. And so in my model, what's actually happening is, let's say this is the crustal area where the aquifers exist and the continent's right here on top of it. What happens is, as the aquifers start, the fountains of the deep break open and the water begins to spew forth, you've got a massive pressure drop. As that pressure drops, what happens is the support under the continents starts to fall, and it's gravitational, and the continent specifically moves towards the outer bound of the continent because it's trapping water directly under its center and can't go in that direction yet. The pressure is coming out from the outside. So what happens is, just like any other normal physical gravitational collapse, as that aquifer starts to get crushed down, the continent starts sliding across it in that direction, and it's basically riding across the heavy layer of water for an extended period of time with very, very limited friction. The friction we see today is because when it finally crashed, all of these busted up rocks start piling up together, and that is part of the whole mountain formation process. Is that once they start piling up like that, yes, the friction increases. And what we actually see in the Earth's crust is, if you look at if you look at some volcanic
10
activity
seconds.
where you've got magma, okay, where you got magma coming up, some of it's very thick, i.e. original mantle material, and some of it's very thin. The very thin stuff is from the frictional heating in certain patchy kind of spots. So that's it.
All right. So I guess that was a comprehensive question. I'm not sure, Mark, if you wanted like a minute response to that and then throw it back to TRock for the final word, we can do that, or we can move on to the next question.
It was TRock's question. I don't want to, break the standard of the person asked as the last person to talk.
Awesome. Cool. All right. We'll move on to the next question. So appreciate it, gentlemen. And thanks for the question, BeamZ. Next questioner is Sean Mock. Question for both. Mark, in your opinion, what is the best evidence that falsifies the global flood hypothesis? And TRock, what is the best evidence that falsifies the secular timeline? We could start in order of the question. So Mark, if you wanted to start, go ahead.
Sure. I think that the biggest thing that falsifies it is the geological record and sort of some of the formations that have gone down, like for instance, tuff is volcanic ash deposits, and these volcanic ash deposits, if they're subjected to water, they become slate and not tuff. And the fact that we have this element everywhere, it sort of shows that it could not be a global flood at all. Because that tuff would not form if it was during a flood. So I think that's probably the best evidence.
Thank you, Mark. TRock, floor is yours.
Okay, best evidence that falsifies the secular timeline. The absolute best evidence is the biblical account of the creation and the flood. That is the best. It's an eyewitness account. People were there, people smart enough to know what their children's names were, how old they were when they were born, whether they built a boat or not, whether they loaded up animals and supplies and so forth. That's the best. If you want from a current day scientific perspective, I think one of the absolute strongest arguments, and it's actually a combination of two things in unison, but magnetic field strength of the Earth is absolutely one of the best arguments that absolutely falsifies the secular timeline. The field strength decline is so fast that you can't wind the clock back even 10,000 years. It puts a very tight limit on the age of the Earth. And in secular science, when you're actually doing physics, the equations basically have, and you can go back and watch one of my previous debates where we talked extensively about this. One of the secular geophysicists basically said that the next reversal should happen in about 3,000 years. Interestingly, that's almost 2 half-lives of the magnetic field strength as we measure it today. So why 3,000 years? Why so short? It's because if you went back 3,000 years, you basically you're at 1/4 of the field strength from 3,000 years, i.e. 1000 BC. And if you go forward 3,000 years from today, that puts you at I'm saying this right, about 1/16 of the field strength from just 3,000 years ago. And they all know that is way too weak of a magnetic field to support life for very long. So they're expecting a reversal in a very short timeline by secular standards anyway, to somewhat correct this anomaly that they know exists in the magnetic field.
Okay, thank you, TRock and Mark, for the answers. Sean, thank you for the question. Next question comes in from Centurion 737. Question for Mark. Have you ever heard of underwater heated vents with water coming out of the deep ocean trenches? Doesn't that mean there's water under the ocean floor?
Yeah, I have heard of that. Hydrothermal vents. Yes, I have. However, we can do some analysis from the way that sort of seismic echoes bounces off to know how much of it there is, and there's certainly not enough to cover the Earth. That is not the case. It's because the water has a completely different sort of texture and it's fluidity to molten lava and magma. And I mean, the reason why it's heated is because it's down towards the magma of the Earth, and sort of so it comes up as sort of steam vents underwater. But that doesn't mean there's like a vast ocean sort of multiple times bigger than the water on the Earth under there. It just means that there is some water under the ocean.
Appreciate it, Mark. TRock, over to you.
Yeah, so that's a great question, because when you talk about a global flood, in the ocean crust, first of all, there are literally springs of water coming out of the ocean floor, for one. For two, the crust of the Earth has two different minerals. One's called ringwoodite, and the other one's called olivine. They're water-bearing minerals. They have a lot of water in them. They do currently have enough water to basically flood the Earth multiple times. But one of the important points that Mark missed is that the floods already happened. The water that came out already came out. It's not in there anymore. It's in the ocean basins now. So yeah, and probably the most important point to understand when you start talking about water under the crust is the amount of collapse that has happened. So I was talking about these aquifer collapses underneath the continents and extending out beyond to the ocean. But on top of that, if you look at the ocean floor, there's what's called guyots, which are basically volcanoes that have come up and then they've been sheared flat across the top. The anomaly there for the deep time paradigm is that they are sometimes as much as a mile below the ocean surface. So now the question becomes, what force is it that sheared off the top of these volcanoes that are so deep, I mean flat, like a crop crew cut, like you mowed your yard across it or something? What force that deep under the ocean floor caused that? And in the young Earth paradigm, the answer is fairly simple. The seafloor was has actually collapsed at that point. Those guyots were, or the original volcanoes were, much closer to the surface, and surface waves sheared them off, and then the seafloor collapsed and went down. So the water has come out of a bunch of water anyway. Definitely not all of it, nowhere near all of it has come out of the crust since then.
Okay, thank you, TRock. Mark, you get the last word. Question was for you.
Yeah, so at least TRock agrees that sort of ocean vents or hydrothermal vents doesn't mean that there is a ton of water under the Earth, and I don't think he's not correct when he sort of says olivine contains so much water it could flood the world, multiple times over. That isn't correct. Yeah, there are rocks that do contain water. Don't get me wrong, but that is just preposterously untrue. This whole idea of where did the water go? Like, he's basically saying that the Earth collapsed. I'm not sure what sort of scientific evidence he's got from that, but like everything else, he probably won't provide any scientific evidence for that. I haven't looked into suboceanic volcanoes and why their tops are sheared off. It may just be the way that they form. It may be a variety of other factors. I don't know because I haven't looked into it. But sort of saying, hey, that proves that they collapsed. That's not scientifically how we do things. It's just an assumption that TRock's making to pull in line with his beliefs, like everything else that he said and claimed and written on MS Paint today. So yeah, I guess back to the question. Yes, I've heard about vents. TRock and I agree. There's not enough water under there. I don't see your point.
All right, thank you, Mark. Next question comes in from Stephen Tibbetts. Question for TRock. I'm guessing question for TRock. Have you heard of the Lost Squadron on Greenland? The plane buried with thousands of annual bands in the space of about 50 years. Temperature changes rather than years.
Short answer, yes, I have. I've actually been to the Ark Encounter, and they have a display on it, and I was aware of it before then, and I've looked at some of the details since then as well. So yeah, I'm fairly familiar with them. It's been a while, granted, but yeah, no, that's a great point, because it's another one, just kind of like the Varves. If those planes hadn't been there, or somebody had not seen that formation happen in short time period, they would have ice core drilled and pulled out cores that look exactly like the ones that they claim, just like Varves. The count of the layers proves tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of years in some cases, and this looks identical to them, but yet here we are. We literally, what they did was they took and basically circulated hot water down through, so they melted the ice deep enough to get to the plains. And I think what they actually managed to do was restore one of the plains that was there. But anyway, in doing that, you can plainly see the I'm going to use the word stratified, although that's probably not what a geologist would say, but you can see the layering and the banding all the way through very deep, and we know conclusively it is like the question states, 50 years or so of time passed to produce that many ice core layers.
Thank you, TRock. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, I've actually encountered this one before, so thank you so much, Stephen, so I can clear this one up, because I've actually run across it before. Yeah, so the problem with the way that you're sort of counting this is, if you take ice core samples, like it shows that they went about 50 years down in these ice core samples. The problem is that the lost squadron, it crashed on an active glacier. Now, you don't take core samples on an active glacier because it's moving and it's active. There's certain things that can happen on it. Also, it crashed on an area that is subject to melting. So what was happening was that the ice layer was melting over the year, and it was actually falling down further and further. So your idea that, because the ice layers show how much time, yes, on a glacier that's an inactive glacier, yes, they do. But on an active glacier, that can be skewed because it's moving, it's melting, it's reforming, all kinds of other things are going on. So this idea is actually you're going about it the wrong way. If it had crashed on an inactive glacier, one that isn't melting or reforming or moving at all, then you might have a point. But unfortunately, the lost squadron isn't. So we would never take ice samples from there.
Okay, thank you, Mark. TRock, you get the last word. Question was for you.
Okay, Mark very well demonstrated exactly what I was describing earlier about modern catastrophes versus catastrophic events that have never been witnessed or recorded in history. This is exactly practically identical to that. Active glacier, what was the word you used, Mark? Active glacial
glaciers.
Active glaciers that are melting and doing things. So if you went to a different ice core that you think is a proper place to take a core sample from, you have no idea whether there were active glaciers under it in the distant past or not. All you know is they don't have them today. You're going to have to default to some other bogus dating method to figure out when you think that active glaciation was happening. And it's just another grand form of the circular reasoning that goes into it. And so furthermore, you can talk to somebody like Michael Ord, who was a career climatologist. I believe he's the one that has done the work on the oxygen isotope ratios that are also used to support things like the Milankovitch theory. Basically, what you learn from the climatologist is that you can get oxygen isotope ratio differences due to just climatic differences in the atmosphere, and come up with very similar patterns to what you see in ice core samples and things like that.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just interject, Johnny? I've just set up an after show on my channel, by the way. Sure. Everybody's welcome, but I've just set it up now for a late night after show. So if you feel like continuing the conversation, come on over.
Awesome. Appreciate it, Mark. Okay, and I think we'll start winding things down as well, as we just hit about the 30-minute mark for these audience questions. To the audience, as always, thank you for all the input, feedback, but also the questions, a great question. So Bubblegum Gun, one of your biggest fans, Mark Reid, he's got a super chat question for you. So thank you, Bubblegum. He says, Mark Reid, are you denying monkeys surf to Brazil with bees?
Monkeys surf to Brazil with bees. Yeah, I'm sure they gave the it was like maybe a hive, and that was like used like a jet engine. They just soared over there. Unfortunately, Bubblegum unfortunately doesn't understand what scientific evidence is either. So poor Bubbles. I feel sorry for him. Do you have anything to add to that one, TRock? Is that?
Go ahead.
No, just the question was kind of outside the scope, other than the fact that in my personal rendering of the young Earth creation account, I never exclude the possibility of humans being the transport mechanism for animals around the world. It is highly excluded in the old Earth paradigm. People 4,000 years ago in the secular paradigm knew how to build some pyramids that almost nobody today alive today know how to build. So 4,000 years ago, people were smart enough to know how to, get monkeys where they need to be. We even train them for, picking bananas and coconuts and stuff like that. In the modern world, people 4,000 years ago were certainly smart enough to do the same thing. So that's my only input. As far as the surfing stuff, I'm kind of agnostic on whether anything got to where it is by surfing, although I know it is absolutely possible. So.
Okay, thank you. Mark, any last words on that one?
Oh yeah, just the idea that sort of humans carried all the animals there. If you've got thousands of animals in a boat and only 8 humans, I don't know. And the animals certainly didn't get carried to the ark, because apparently they came on their own, which is weird, and sort of, never addressed how the koalas got there without eucalyptus, or, the sloth got to where it's going. Sloth is a big animal. I'm not sure you could carry that anywhere, to be honest with you. I think that carrying a pair of sloths is going to do you in after a few hundred meters. And some of the other big animals that are incredibly slow, I don't know how you would carry them anywhere. So that's just a weird statement. I'm just imagining someone, carrying a giraffe to Africa and carrying, the cassowary without being ripped apart, or carrying the cassowary to Australia and this bird's just going, like, that's just such a ridiculous option. Anyway, that's, yeah. But thanks. That's actually funny.
All right, Mark and TRock, you've endured to the end. We've hit the 3-hour mark, and it really was an engaging debate, a debate to remember. I've been looking forward to this specific one on the Genesis flood. And so great job to the both of you. I really appreciate your time for these debates. Mark, you are having an after show immediately following this, I'm assuming. And so anybody who wants to continue the discussion tonight, Saturday Night Showdown, go over to Mark's and engage in the discussion. So why don't we get some final words, final thoughts, though? Mark and TRock, again, thank you so much for doing this. Mark, why don't we start with you? Final words, final thoughts?
On anything? Or what?
Yeah, I guess anything, as long as, we keep it, TRock and Mark, let's say, to a minute. Anything okay. You just want, even plug your channel, any final things that come
I do debates, so if you do like debates, come along. I try to do discussions and other things as well, but yeah, just the whole idea that sort of proving your worldview wrong proves mine wrong. Nothing works like that. You have to prove yours right, and that's what we lack today, is scientific evidence that TRock's view of the flood is actually right. All he did is attack the mainstream science that sort of, just proving it wrong doesn't prove yours right. You have to actually do that by yourself. So thanks.
Thank you, Mark. I'll give your next couple debates a shout out, since I do have,
cheers,
I think at least one of the photos here. So Matt Naylor, or Raw Matt, as some people know him, and Mark Reid, they'll be debating at the end of the month. Is there scientific evidence for evolution? And Mark and David McQueen will also be debating in June the topic of young Earth creation on trial, more or less. So I'm looking forward to both of those. And so if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, make sure to subscribe, hit that like button, also hit that notification bell. You don't want to miss these debates. Okay, TRock, thank you as well for the time you've given to us for this debate. I'll hand it over to you for some final words, final thoughts.
Yeah, again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and participating and helping put this together. As far as the evidence, yes, I showed a lot of evidence, standard modern physical evidence, the whole tensile strength thing, if you've never actually had to apply that in the real working world, you may not understand the significance of it. I get that, but I think everybody understands that rock breaks rather easy, and when it's, especially when it's in large, massive bodies that are shifting in different directions, pulling on it, and so the evidence, that is the evidence that the continents had to have moved rapidly instead. Are there aquifers all over the world? Yeah, there are. There are crushed aquifers all over the world. Yeah, there's sinkholes all over the world. There's lots and lots of evidence. That's what we were building towards. I don't want to introduce a whole bunch of new stuff, but that is the evidence is you have to explain that a slow process cannot work. The evidence that I did show demonstrates that very clearly. Again, maybe sometime in the future. This is actually the material that you would do in a kind of a solo presentation kind of thing, not a back and forth conversation, because there's a lot of information to digest to get people to think along those lines that don't normally do that sort of thing. So thank you, guys.
All right, TRock, thank you for the final words, final thoughts. Mark, thank you as well. And to our guest tonight, thank you very much for making for a very comprehensive debate. I've had a lot of fun, and I know the audience has as well. Been quite the live chat tonight, very lively live chat with some great questions. So with that, we are going to wrap things up. And thanks for tuning in all. Standing for Truth is out.